The hands went up one by one. Rand counted them the way she counted everything that mattered, quietly, without letting her face betray the arithmetic. 10 hands. 11. The great hall of Lord Aldrich's estate threw candlelight across faces she had spent 4 years learning to read. She read them now. They were not cruel. They were simply convenient, and she was simply inconvenient, and in a court built on calculation, that was the only math that had ever mattered. She stood in the center of the hall because she had been asked to stand there. Lord Aldrich called it procedural, as though the vote were weather, as though she were here by coincidence. Her eyes moved once to the high seat. King Caelen sat perfectly still. His hands rested on the chair's carved arms. They did not rise against her. They did not rise for her. They simply rested and did nothing, and in a court built on power. She had long understood that silence was never truly neutral. She held his gaze for one full breath. He looked away first. Rand turned and walked toward the door. Spine straight. Steps even. She crossed the threshold without looking back. Beneath her heel, the cracked flagstone sealed, quietly, permanently, perfectly, as though it had been waiting for years for exactly this moment. No one noticed. She walked out into the cold morning, and the door closed behind her, and the stone remembered every step. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I love to know how far this story reaches. She had been waking before dawn for so long that her body no longer needed to be told. There was no alarm, no bell, no hand on her shoulder. There was simply the particular quality of darkness that existed in the hour before the household stirred, a darkness that felt inhabited rather than empty, full of the breathing of sleeping people who would wake in an hour and expect the world to be in order. And Rand's eyes opened into it with the practiced calm of someone who had made peace with being the reason the world was in order without ever being counted as part of it. She rose. She dressed. She did not light a candle until she reached the account's room, because candles cost something. And she had never been able to stop tracking what things cost, even things as small as light. The account's room was the best room in the household, in Rand's private estimation, because it was the only room where the truth was required. Numbers did not perform. Numbers did not arrange themselves into courtesy or hierarchy or the careful social architecture that governed every other space in Lord Aldrich's estate. They simply were what they were, and if you read them correctly, they told you everything about how a household actually functioned versus how it believed itself to function. Rand had been reading them correctly for 4 years. The household believed itself to be prosperous and well managed. The numbers told a more complicated story, and Rand was the only person who knew both versions. She opened the ledger to the supply column and found the discrepancy she had suspected since yesterday afternoon. The grain shipment from the northern storehouse had been logged twice. Not maliciously, the understeward was not dishonest. Only careless in the particular way that people became careless when they had never been asked to be precise. The double entry would have created a paper surplus that would eventually become a real deficit. And the real deficit would have arrived at the worst possible time, the way deficits always did. Rand corrected it in her small, exact handwriting, noted the correction in the margin, and moved to the next column. By the time the kitchen fires were being lit 2 floors below, she had balanced 3 months of irregular supply records, identified a vendor who had been systematically under-delivering the premium candle wax while charging for the full quantity, and restructured the household's winter fuel budget in a way that would save enough to re-roof the east stable before the cold came. She noted all of it. She would present none of it under her own name. She would leave the corrected ledger on Lord Aldrich's steward's desk, and the steward would present the findings as his own morning review. And Lord Aldrich would nod and say that Harwick was a reliable man, and Rand would be in the kitchen by then, having already moved on to the next thing that needed doing. This was not bitterness. She had examined it carefully enough to know the difference. It was simply the shape of her daily life, as familiar and unremarkable to her as the grain of the wooden table beneath her palms. At the 7th hour, the household woke in full, the corridors filled with the particular organized chaos of a noble estate beginning its day. Footsteps. Instructions, the smell of breakfast moving upward through the floors. Rand moved through it like water moves through a landscape, finding the path of least obstruction. Present everywhere she was needed, and invisible everywhere she was not. She intercepted the head cook before he could send the wrong cut of meat to the morning table. Lord Aldrich had a guest with a dietary restriction that Ran had noted 3 weeks ago when the invitation was accepted, and that the head cook, despite being told twice, had not retained. She redirected a delivery that had arrived at the wrong entrance. She resolved a quiet dispute between 2 household members over a scheduling conflict, mediating it so gently that neither party fully registered that a third person had been involved. At midday, she passed through the main dining hall carrying a stack of correspondence that needed sorting. 3 people passed her in the corridor outside it. None of them spoke to her. One of them, Lady Mira, Lord Aldrich's niece, who wore perfume that cost more than Rant's annual household stipend, looked directly through her with the particular transparency of someone for whom certain people had simply ceased to register as fully present. Rand was used to this. She had been used to it for a long time. But there was a difference, she had discovered, between being used to something and being unmarked by it. The mark was quiet. It lived somewhere beneath her sternum, a small persistent pressure, like a stone sitting on a place that had not quite healed. In the late afternoon, she crossed the main courtyard on her way to the outer storage buildings. The cobblestones were old here, uneven, worn into dips and rises by generations of passing feet. She had crossed this courtyard 1,000 times. She crossed it now with her usual purposeful stride, and something made her slow, not a sound, not a sight, but a sensation beneath her feet. A warmth, a faint and inexplicable solidity, as though the ground were responding to the specific weight of her step, as though the stones were recognizing something. Rand stopped. She looked down at the courtyard stones beneath her boots. She had never looked at them carefully before. She looked now, and she noticed, in the way that you only notice things once your eyes had been given a reason to look, that the stones directly beneath her most traveled path across this courtyard were different from the rest. Not visibly different, not in any way she could have pointed to for another person. But they were more level, more settled. The gaps between them were finer. The surface was smoother in a way that had nothing to do with wear, because wear roughened stone over time rather than smoothed it. She had walked this path every day for 4 years. The warmth beneath her feet pulsed once, gently, like a response. Rand stood very still in the middle of the courtyard and did not understand what she was feeling, only that she was feeling something. Only that the ground beneath her had always known she was there even when no one else did. She did not have words for it yet. She filed it in the same careful interior space where she filed all the things she did not yet have words for. And she continued across the courtyard toward the storage buildings, and the stones beneath her last steps settled fractionally deeper into the earth, as though they were holding on. She left the estate on a Tuesday. Not because Tuesday held any particular significance, but because that was the day the procedure concluded. Lord Aldrich's steward had used that word, procedure, with the same careful neutrality his lord favored, as though language precise enough could sand the human edges off of any situation, and because there was no reason to wait beyond it. Ran had no lease to close out, no formal relationship to dissolve, no farewell audience scheduled with anyone who might wish to give one. She had a room, a small bundle of belongings, and the understanding that both the room and any claim to it had expired simultaneously with the raising of 11 hands. She packed with the same economy she brought to everything: 2 changes of clothing, the household accounts ledger, her own personal copy, the one she had kept in parallel with the official record, in the small precise handwriting that no one had ever asked to see. A pressed wildflower, tucked into the ledger's oldest page. A pair of worn but sturdy walking boots that she had resoled herself twice. She carried the bundle through the corridor, down the main staircase, across the entrance hall, and out through the side door that servants used because the front entrance was for people the household considered worth a formal departure. She did not look back at the house. She looked, instead, at the road. The estate's outer road ran from the main gate to the junction with the King's Highway approximately a quarter-mile east, a stretch of packed earth and old stone that she had walked every time a delivery arrived, every time a message needed carrying to the village, every time the accumulated smallness of her invisible daily life had required the particular relief of open air and forward motion. She knew this road the way you knew the face of someone you had never been formally introduced to, but had lived beside for years. Its irregularities, its moods in different weather. The place near the old elm where the drainage had never been properly managed, and the ground turned soft after rain. She was not thinking about the road when she began to walk it. She was thinking about the next practical step, and the one after that. The arithmetic of survival for a woman leaving a household with no letter of reference, no formal status, no destination. She was thinking in the particular focused way of someone who understood that forward motion was the only available response to a situation that could not be changed by standing still. She was almost at the gate when something made her stop. Not a sound, not a voice. The same pull she had felt in the courtyard. Only stronger now, a warmth rising through the soles of her boots, a recognition. As though the road itself were reaching upward the way a person reaches toward something familiar. Ran looked down. The stretch of road beneath her feet was smooth. Not worn smooth, she understood now, looking carefully. The difference between the smoothness of erosion and the smoothness of something made right. The stones were level and fitted together with a precision that the original road had never possessed. The drainage channels on either side of her immediate path were clear and correctly angled. There was no gap, no loose edge, no place where the surface had cracked and not healed. She turned around slowly and looked back toward the estate. The entire path she had walked every morning for 4 years, her specific path. The line her feet had traced through habit and necessity across this stretch of road was different from the earth on either side of it. Perfect, permanent, exactly as wide as her footsteps. Her breath came out slowly. A memory surfaced, unbidden, the way the oldest memories always surfaced, not smoothly but all at once, complete. She was 7 years old. She was walking barefoot on the muddy farm path that ran between her family's quarters and the main well. The path that turned to sucking clay every time it rained, and that she walked every morning before light to draw water before the farm's day began. She remembered the particular misery of cold mud between small toes. She remembered wishing, with the complete and uncomplicated sincerity of childhood, that the path were easier, that it were solid, that it held. She remembered walking it. And she remembered, though she had filed it away in the category of things too strange to examine, that the morning after she had walked that path with every cell of her small body wishing it solid, a farmer from 2 properties over had come to speak with her father in a confused and slightly odd tone about the road that had appeared between the well and the eastern quarters. A perfect stone track, he said, overnight, from nowhere. Her father had not looked at her. No one had looked at her. The road had remained. She had filed the memory in the place where she kept things too strange to hold, and she had not thought of it in 15 years. She thought of it now. Ran stood at the gate of Lord Aldrich's estate with her small bundle over one shoulder and the King's highway visible in the distance, and she understood, with the clean, sudden clarity of something that had always been true finally being spoken aloud in the interior of herself, what she carried. Not a serving woman's gray dress. Not a corrected ledger. Not the polite silence of someone trained to take up as little space as possible. She carried this. She looked at the King's highway stretching east and west in both directions. Its surface worn and cracked and imperfect in the way of all roads that had been used hard and maintained poorly. And she felt the warmth rise through her soles like a question waiting to be answered. She took one deliberate step off the estate's road and onto the King's highway. The ground answered her. She felt it, the deep, immediate response of the earth beneath the packed surface. The way it recognized the intention in her step and rose to meet it, compacting and leveling and settling into something that would not shift or crack or fade regardless of what weather or weight came after her. The road beneath her foot became, in the single second of her stepping, exactly what a road was supposed to be. Ran exhaled. She took another step, and another, each one deliberate, each one a choice. Behind her, the section of King's Highway where she had walked was already different from the road on either side of it, smoother, more solid, faintly warmer to the touch in the cool morning air, as though it were still holding the memory of her passing. She did not look back at it. She looked forward at the long road east, at the horizon that held no particular promise except the one she was making herself with every step, and she began to walk with purpose for the first time in 4 years. Far away, in the palace at the kingdom's center, a cartographer spread a newly updated survey map across his table and frowned at an anomaly in the eastern borderlands. A road had appeared on the survey. A short stretch, barely a quarter-mile, running along the King's Highway near the Aldrich Estate junction. It was marked in the surveyor's notation as origin unknown. Surface condition, exceptional. No construction orders on record. The cartographer made a note to investigate and moved on to the next map. The note sat at the bottom of a stack of correspondence on King Caelen's desk for 3 days before anyone opened it. The memory came back to her on a hillside above a village called Marin's Crossing. It was her 3rd winter in exile, and the village had been waiting for a road for longer than most of its oldest residents could remember. Ran had been approaching it from the western ridge for 2 days, walking the precise line she had surveyed on foot the week before, laying stone as she went in the unhurried and methodical way she had learned to work, not rushing, because the gift did not respond well to rushing, because intention required patience the way good bread required time, because she had discovered over 3 years of walking that the earth beneath her feet was not interested in urgency. It was interested in purpose. The village appeared below her in the gray afternoon light, like something a careful hand had set down gently and then forgotten to return to. 12 houses, a shared well with a cracked surround, fields that told the story of people working very hard on land that was not cooperating, a single track of churned mud where a road should have been, deeply rutted by the wheels of supply carts that came infrequently and left quickly, as though the village's misfortune were a condition that might prove contagious. Ran paused on the hillside and looked down at it. She was not thinking about her mother yet. She was thinking about the drainage problem on the lower slope, the way the ground's gradient would need to be accounted for in the road's final approach to the village center. She was thinking practically, the way she always thought first, because practical thinking was armor of a kind, and she had worn it for a long time. And then, without warning or preamble, the memory arrived. She was 12 years old. The memory had that quality of absolute completeness that only the most significant memories possessed, not the soft edges of ordinary recollection, but the sharp, overlit clarity of something the mind had decided, without being asked, to preserve in full. Her mother's name was Seela. Seela had been an Omega healer in the household of Lord Fenwick, 2 territories east of where Ran would one day find herself in Lord Aldrich's grey dress. Seela's gift was warmth, a true healer's warmth, the kind that could draw fever out of a body the way a poultice drew infection from a wound. Slow and patient, and more effective than anything the household's formally appointed physician could manage with his leather bag of remedies. The household physician knew this. He resented it with the particular passion of a man who had studied for many years to do something that a low-ranked Omega woman could do better without any study at all. Seela used her gift carefully. She used it only when asked. She kept herself to the household's sick quarters and the domestic staff, and she did not overstep. Because she understood, she had always understood. And she had taught Ran to understand, exactly where the edges of her permission lay. Then there was the child. Ran remembered him. A small boy, perhaps 4 years old. The son of a farmer who supplied the household with winter vegetables. The farmer had arrived one morning with his cart and his boy running alongside it. And the boy had been wrong, visibly frighteningly wrong. The grayness of a fever that had gone too far sitting on his small face, like a shadow deciding to stay. The household physician was away. Lord Fenwick was in his city residence. The household ran on reduced staff. Seela had looked at the boy for the space of 3 breaths. Then she had placed her hands on either side of his face and drawn the fever out of him, right there in the courtyard, in front of the farmer and the 2 stable hands and the undercook who had come outside to watch. The boy's color returned. His eyes cleared. He had looked up at Seela with the uncomplicated gratitude of a small child who did not understand what had happened, only that the terrible thing had stopped. It took perhaps 4 minutes. The household physician returned 2 days later. The formal review took less time than the healing had. Seela was called to stand in the household's receiving room. Ran was not supposed to be there, but she was there, pressed against the wall inside the door in the way of a 12-year-old who understood that something important was happening and that she would not be permitted to witness it if she announced herself. Lord Fenwick sat in his formal chair. The physician stood at his right hand. The charge was clear. Seela had used her gift beyond the scope of her authorized function. She had practiced healing on a person outside the household without explicit permission. She had, by doing so, implicitly claimed a standing she did not possess. Caelen stood in the center of the room. Ran watched her mother's face. Her mother did not argue. She did not point to the boy's recovery, to the absence of the physician, to the simple human arithmetic of a sick child and a person capable of helping him. She stood with her spine straight and her hands folded and her eyes on a point slightly above Lord Fenwick's shoulder, and she said very quietly, "I understand. I accept the household's judgment." Her healer's mark, the small formal brand on her left wrist that authorized her to practice within the household, was declared invalid that afternoon. It was not removed, because that would have required a procedure more formal than Lord Fenwick wished to conduct. It was simply declared not to count. Her gift remained. Her permission to use it was revoked. They left the household the following week. Ran remembered walking out through the gate beside her mother, each of them carrying a bundle not so different from the bundle Ran would carry 15 years later on a Tuesday morning in a gray dress. She remembered looking up at her mother's face, searching for the thing she needed most to find there, some sign of resistance, some ember of refusal, some evidence that what had happened had not simply been accepted as the natural order of things. Her mother had looked down at her. Her expression was not defeated. It was something more complicated and more heartbreaking than defeat. It was the face of a woman who had made a precise and clear-eyed calculation about the cost of protest and had decided, with full awareness, that she could not afford it. Not for herself, for her daughter, because a mother who protested became an example. And examples paid in currencies that 12-year-old girls were not equipped to afford. Caelen had taken Rant's hand and she had said, very quietly into her daughter's hair, "Your gift belongs to you. But your gift's permission belongs to whoever holds power above you. Never forget the difference. Stay quiet. Stay useful. Stay small enough that they do not feel the need to make an example of you." Ran had carried that lesson for 15 years. She had carried it through 4 years in Lord Aldrich's household, through every morning of pre-dawn accounting, and every afternoon of invisible competence, and every moment of being looked through by people whose houses she kept running. She had carried it through 11 raised hands and a king's stillness and a Tuesday morning departure through a side door. She had carried it here to this hillside above this village, in the gray afternoon light of her 3rd winter of exile. She looked down at Marin's crossing. She looked at the mud track where a road should have been. She thought of her mother's voice and her mother's hands, and the boy whose fever she had drawn out in 4 minutes in a courtyard, and the way the gift's permission had been declared invalid while the gift itself remained, entirely intact, entirely hers, entirely unable to be taken no matter what any lord or physician or formal review decided. She thought about what she had been doing for 3 years. She had been walking. Every step deliberate, every road an act of intention. She had not asked permission. She had not announced herself. She had simply walked, and the earth had answered. And the roads she left behind her were as real and as permanent as anything that had ever been formally commissioned and constructed and credited to someone with the correct standing to receive credit. She had broken her mother's lesson. Not through defiance. She had not screamed or protested or made herself an example. She had broken it in the quietest possible way. She had simply walked forward, and the world had changed beneath her feet. And no one had been able to stop it, because no one had understood what was happening until it was already done. A sound from below. A child's voice, high and carrying in the cold air, growing louder as small feet churned up the hillside path toward where Ran stood. A girl, perhaps 8 years old, dark-haired and out of breath, looking up at Ran with the direct fearlessness of a child who had not yet learned the geometry of social caution. The girl pointed at the section of road visible behind Ran on the ridge, the smooth stone line she had been laying for 2 days, glowing faintly warm even in the overcast afternoon light. "Who built that?" the girl demanded, in the tone of someone who considered this the most important question currently available. Ran looked at her for a moment. She thought of her mother. She thought of a declaration made invalid while the gift itself persisted. She thought of 11 hands and a king's stillness and a cracked flagstone that had sealed itself in the second of her crossing. She said, quietly but without any hesitation at all, "I did." The girl stared at her with enormous eyes. Ran shifted her bundle on her shoulder and began walking down the hillside toward the village. And the road formed behind her with every step, and it did not crack, and it did not crumble. and it did not require anyone's permission to remain exactly what it was. 3 years was long enough for a kingdom to forget how it had functioned before something existed. That was the thought that occupied King Caelen's mind as his horse carried him east along the king's highway on a morning that smelled of coming rain. His small escort of 6 riders spread out behind him in the loose formation of a party that did not expect trouble. 3 years since the roads had begun appearing. 3 years since his cartographers had started adding new lines to the survey maps with the increasingly bewildered notation of men recording miracles they lacked the professional vocabulary to describe. Exceptional surface condition. Origin unknown. No construction orders on record. The notations had grown more elaborate over time, as though sufficient technical language might eventually explain what simpler language could not. They never did. He had the latest trade report in his saddlebag. He had read it twice at breakfast, which was not something he did with trade reports as a rule. But this one had required reading twice because the numbers in it were the kind of numbers that changed the shape of what you thought was possible. A third of the kingdom's new economic activity in 3 years traced directly to improved road access in the borderland regions. 47 villages now connected to trade routes they had been isolated from for generations. Grain moving where grain had not moved before. Medicine reaching places that had been losing children to preventable illness for longer than anyone had been keeping count. The kingdom was, by every measurable standard, significantly more alive than it had been 3 years ago. And the roads responsible for all of it had no builder on record. This bothered Caelen in a way that went beyond the administrative inconvenience of unattributed infrastructure. It bothered him the way a sound in the walls of a familiar house bothered a person, persistently, at the edge of attention, suggesting something structural that had not yet been examined. He told himself he was riding east to inspect the newest road personally, to meet with the borderland governors, to demonstrate the Crown's investment in the region's development. All of this was true. He was a thorough king, and these were legitimate reasons, and he held them in the front of his mind, with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to giving himself adequate explanations. The thing he did not examine rode with him anyway. The borderland forest began 2 hours east of the last village on the highway, the road narrowing as the tree line closed in on either side, the canopy thickening overhead until the gray morning sky was reduced to fragments visible between branches. The escort tightened formation instinctively. This was not dangerous territory, precisely, but it was territory that had been subject to increased Thornvale faction activity over the past year. The Thornvale being a coalition of noble houses that had grown steadily more hostile to the Crown's new trade policies, which had shifted economic advantage away from the established overland merchants who paid Thornvale levies and toward the borderland villages that did not. Caelen was aware of the Thornvale threat. He had been managing it through diplomatic and economic channels for 18 months. He had perhaps underestimated how far the management had failed. The attack came from the left side of the road, from the dense undergrowth where the drainage channel ran, in the form of a coordinated movement that his escort's lead rider recognized and called warning for approximately 2 seconds before the situation became something other than manageable. It was not a large force, 6 riders masked moving fast. It was precisely sized, Caelen would think later, to scatter a small escort without committing enough force to constitute an act of war that could be formally attributed. Deniable. Precise. The work of people who had planned this specific road, this specific morning, this specific party size. The escort scattered as trained. 2 riders drew off 3 of the attackers. 2 more moved to flank. The remaining 2, his personal guard, positioned themselves at Caelen's sides. And one of them took a blow meant for the king that sent him from the saddle in a way that ended his involvement in the morning's events immediately. The other guard's horse was struck and lost its footing on the road's edge, going down in the drainage channel in a controlled fall that the guard survived, but that removed him from the immediate vicinity for the critical seconds that followed. Caelen's horse, responding to the chaos with the honest terror of an animal that did not share its rider's training, bolted. He let it run. Pulling against a genuinely panicked horse on a narrow forest road was a reliable way to end up beneath it, and he was not so proud that he preferred a dignified death to an undignified survival. He rode the bolt, working gradually to slow and steer rather than stop, until the horse's panic spent itself on a long uphill stretch that left them both breathing hard on a section of road he did not immediately recognize. He stopped. He took stock. He was alone. His shoulder was bleeding. He had not registered the cut during the bolt, but he registered it now. The wet warmth spreading under his riding coat, not serious but not nothing. His horse was trembling and would need rest before it could be reliably ridden. His escort was somewhere behind him, engaged in a situation whose resolution he did not know. His saddlebag, containing the trade report and his personal seal and several other items of both practical and political significance, was still attached to the saddle, which was one small thing in his favor. The forest was very quiet. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements calm for the horse's benefit, and he assessed the road around him. He did not know precisely where he was. The bolt had taken him off the section of highway he knew well, and the forest roads in this region branched in ways that the older maps handled inconsistently. He was somewhere east of the last waypoint. The sky, visible in pieces through the canopy, was moving toward late afternoon with the indifference of skies toward the difficulties of kings. Welcome back to the Whispers of Alpha King channel. Today we're going to present a new story that I believe you'll be very curious about and interested in because of its incredibly captivating content. Now let's explore it together until the end of the video. This is a fictional story compiled from various sources, supported by AI, and the content is purely for entertainment and educational purposes. He needed shelter before dark. He needed to clean and bind the shoulder wound. He needed, before any of that, to understand which direction would take him toward a known waypoint rather than deeper into unfamiliar forest. He stood in the road and he looked east, where the light was failing fastest. And then he looked west, where the road curved out of sight around a stand of old birch trees, and then something made him look directly ahead. The road in front of him changed. Not dramatically, not with any sound or light or signal that he could have pointed to as a specific moment of alteration. But the section of road that had been, a moment ago, packed earth with the worn irregularities of a path that saw occasional use, that section was different now. Level. Fitted. The surface carrying that particular quality of permanence he had seen on the survey maps and never understood until this moment, standing on the road himself, feeling through the soles of his boots the difference between ground that merely held and ground that had been made right. The road stretched ahead of him into the forest. It had not been there a moment ago. Caelen stood very still and looked at the road that had appeared before him in the failing afternoon light of a borderland forest on the worst day he had experienced in 3 years of kingship. And he felt something move in him that was not quite recognition, and not quite relief, and not quite the thing he had been refusing to examine since a Tuesday morning when 11 hands had risen in a great hall and one had not. He picked up his horse's reins. He began to walk. The road held perfectly beneath every step, warm even in the cooling evening air, solid in a way that made the forest on either side of it feel slightly less absolute. He followed it around a curve and through a stand of pine and up a gentle rise, and there, at the rise's crest, visible against the darkening sky with the particular clarity of something that had been deliberately placed rather than accidentally found, was a small stone waystation cottage. Light in the window. Smoke from the chimney. Caelen stopped at the road's edge and looked at the cottage and felt his heart do something complicated inside his chest that he did not have the emotional vocabulary to name precisely, only that it was connected somehow to pressed wildflowers and ledger margins and a woman who had walked out of a hall on a Tuesday morning without looking back. He had not thought of it as a connection until this moment. He thought of it now. Ran had felt the pull at mid-afternoon. She had been working the upper ridge line, laying the final approach of a road that would connect the Forest Way station to the main eastern highway, walking the precise surveyed line with the focused deliberateness that the gift required, not trance, not unconsciousness, but the particular quality of full presence that she had come to think of as the opposite of how she had spent 4 years in Lord Aldrich's household. There, she had made herself as absent as possible while remaining physically present. Here, she made herself entirely present. Every cell of her attention given to the ground beneath her feet, to the intention of connection, to the purpose of the path she was laying. The pull interrupted all of it. It came from below her sternum, from the place she had spent 3 years refusing to name. And it came with a sharpness that made her breath catch and her next step falter, the only falter in 3 years of walking, which was how she knew it was serious. The gift did not falter. She faltered. Whatever was pulling at her was pulling at the human part of her. The part that existed beneath the gift and beneath the 4 years of careful erasure and beneath the 15 years of her mother's lesson. She stood on the ridge and she pressed one hand flat against her sternum and she breathed. She knew what the pull was. She had known its name for 3 years while refusing to use it. In the Omnigaverse's oldest understanding, the bond between a matched pair was not a choice or a feeling or a social arrangement. It was a living thread, as real as the road beneath her feet, connecting two people at a level deeper than decision. You could refuse to acknowledge it. You could walk away from it. You could spend 3 years in exile building roads across the forgotten borderlands of a kingdom and become so thoroughly yourself, so thoroughly purposeful and capable and whole, that the thread felt almost theoretical. Almost. The sharpness beneath her sternum said, "He is hurt." Rand closed her eyes. She stayed still for 3 breaths, long ones, the kind that required choosing. The kind her mother had taught her as a child as the correct response to any situation that asked you to act before you had thought clearly. First breath, what is true? Second breath, what is needed? Third breath, what will you do? What was true was that the bond was pulling her south along the ridge toward the way station road. What was needed was probably medical attention. Based on the specific quality of the pull, not danger urgent, not life or death immediate, but the steady insistent pull of injury asking to be addressed. What she would do she already knew before the third breath finished. Because she had been honest with herself for 3 years, even when honesty was inconvenient. And the honest answer was that she had never been able to not respond to something that needed her. She adjusted her pack and walked south. She found him at the road's edge 200 yards from the way station, sitting against the base of a birch tree with his horse standing patiently beside him, and his hand pressed against his left shoulder, and his eyes tracking her approach with the careful alertness of an injured man who had not yet decided if what was walking toward him was a problem or a solution. The dim forest light was kind to both of them. He was travel-worn and pale beneath the weathering of an outdoor afternoon. His riding coat dark with blood at the left shoulder. His hair disordered from riding hard, and everything that had come after. He was not wearing his crown. Of course, no one road inspection routes in a crown, and without it he was simply a large, dark-eyed, injured man at the side of a road, and Rand permitted herself, in the moment before she got close enough for recognition, to become a risk. To look at his face with the directness she had never allowed herself in 4 years of peripheral watching. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than the afternoon's events. He looked like a man who had been managing something heavy for a long time and had gotten very good at not letting the weight show in his public posture. And the effort of that management was visible, now only because the public posture had been knocked loose by a bolt through a forest and an afternoon alone. She filed this observation away and kept walking. She crouched beside him without speaking and moved his hand away from the shoulder wound with the calm authority of someone who had dressed enough injuries over 3 years of solitary road building to know the difference between alarming and manageable. This was manageable. A clean cut, not deep enough to threaten anything structural, already beginning to slow on its own. It needed cleaning and binding, and it would not trouble him beyond the next few days. She worked in silence. She had clean cloth in her pack. She always carried it. Because roads under construction produced the kind of minor injuries that did not wait for formal medical attendance, and a small flask of the antiseptic solution she prepared from a combination of borderland herbs she had learned from a village healer in her first winter of exile. She cleaned the wound with steady hands and felt him tense once, sharply, at the sting of the solution, and heard him breathe through it without making a sound, which told her something about the quality of his self-discipline, even in a diminished state. She began to bind the shoulder. He watched her hands. After a long moment, in a voice that was rougher than she remembered it, but carried the same quality of careful precision she had spent 4 years observing from the edges of rooms, he said, "You built this road." It was not a question. He had come around the curve and seen the way station and the road leading to it, and he understood. On some level, he had not yet fully articulated even to himself what he was looking at. She did not answer immediately. She tied the binding, checked its tension, and sat back on her heels. She said, The way station has a fire and a water supply and enough dried provisions to last 3 days. Your horse can be sheltered in the lean-to on the eastern side. He looked at her. She looked back at the binding. He said, I'm not going to ask how you came to be exactly where I needed someone to be. She said, good. A silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She had expected the proximity to feel dangerous. The way a wound felt dangerous before you cleaned it, full of potential for worse things. Instead it felt like the particular quality of a road she had just finished laying. Solid and real, and neither more nor less than what it was. She helped him to his feet. She settled his horse in the lean-to with feed from the way station's small stores. She built the fire higher and heated water and set out the provisions with the economic efficiency of someone who had learned to do everything necessary without wasted motion. He sat in the way station's single chair and watched her move through the small space and said nothing, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. Outside, the forest night settled in fully. The road she had laid that afternoon cooled slowly in the darkness, its surface retaining a faint warmth that a person walking it at midnight would have felt through the soles of their boots, a residual aliveness. The memory of intention pressed permanently into stone. Inside the way station, the fire burned. Rand sat across from him in the second chair, her pack at her feet, her hands wrapped around a cup of heated water. And she did not look at his face, and she did not address the thing beneath her sternum, and she did not ask the questions that were lining up in the interior of herself with the patience of things that had been waiting 3 years already and could wait a little longer. He settled deeper into the chair. His eyes grew heavy. The fever that followed blood loss was beginning its work, pulling him towards sleep with the insistence of a tide. In the space between waking and sleep, in the soft disordered country, where the discipline of a king no longer stood guard over everything, his lips moved. He said her name. Not road woman, not an approximation, not the careful social distance of someone maintaining appropriate uncertainty. Her name, Ran, said with the specific weight of a word that had been held in the mouth for a long time. Ran sat very still in her chair. She looked at his sleeping face, and the fire crackled, and the road outside held the warmth of her passing, and she did not move for a very long time. The fever broke on the second morning. Rand knew it before he opened his eyes because the quality of his breathing changed, losing the tight, effortful rhythm of a body working hard against something and settling into the easier cadence of a body that had won. She had been awake since before dawn, as she always was. Sitting at the way station's small table, with the accounts ledger she carried everywhere. Not working in it, but holding it the way some people held familiar objects when they needed to think clearly. The pressed wildflower on the oldest page. The small precise handwriting that no one had ever asked to see. She put the ledger away before he opened his eyes. He woke slowly in stages, the way people woke from fever sleep, first the physical awareness, then the gradual reconstruction of where he was and how he had arrived there, then the moment when full consciousness reassembled itself, and he turned his head and found her sitting at the table, and his expression did something complicated that she did not try to read too precisely. Good morning, she said, because it was, and because simplicity was a kindness in the first moments after fever. He sat up carefully, tested the shoulder, found it stiff but functional. He looked around the way station with the systematic attention of someone taking inventory of a situation. Small stone building. Single room. Fire burning low. 2 chairs, 1 table. Packed earth floor covered with the woven mat she had added to the way station's furnishings herself, because she had understood that a shelter only functioned as a shelter if it felt like one. He said, "How long?" She said, "This is the second morning. Your escort will be searching for you. They will likely find the road and follow it here within the day." He nodded. He accepted this information without visible relief or visible distress. Simply incorporated it into whatever calculation he was running. And she recognized the quality of that acceptance. It was what composure looked like when it had been practiced long enough to become genuine rather than performed. She heated water. She brought him a cup and the remainder of the dried provisions, and she checked the shoulder binding with the same impersonal efficiency she had applied to everything since she found him at the road's edge. Maintaining the careful professional distance that she had constructed around herself like a second way station. Something with walls and a fire and enough provision to survive in. something she had built with as much deliberate intention as any road. He watched her hands again while she worked. He said, "Eventually, tell me about the roads." She sat back. She considered. She said, "What would you like to know?" He said, "How you decide where to build them." She looked at the fire for a moment. She said, "I walk to where the need is greatest, and I listen to the ground. The ground knows where it wants a road. Where the weight of people's daily movement has worn a wish for something better into the earth. I walk the line of that wish." He was quiet for a moment, turning this over. He said, "You make it sound as though the road already exists and you simply reveal it." She said, "That is more or less exactly what it is." He said, "And you've been doing this for 3 years. Alone." She said, "I preferred alone to the alternative." The words landed precisely where she had not entirely intended them to land. And the silence that followed them was different from the comfortable silences of the previous day. It had a shape to it. A specific weight, the shape of something that had been named without being fully named. He looked at her directly. He said, "I owe you an account of myself that I don't know how to give adequately." She said, "You don't owe me anything you're not ready to give accurately." He said, "That's a generous position." She said, "It isn't generosity. It's practicality. An inaccurate account is worse than silence. I have had enough of people's convenient versions of events." Something shifted in his face. She watched it happen, the slight alteration around his eyes that indicated a man encountering a truth he had been arranging around for some time without looking at it directly. He said slowly, "I told myself it was a matter of household procedure. That a king cannot intervene in the internal management decisions of his noble houses without creating a precedent that destabilizes the entire noble system." She said nothing. She waited. She had learned that waiting, when applied with patience rather than pressure, was one of the most powerful forces available to a person without formal authority. He said, "I told myself that for a long time. It was not entirely false. The precedent concern is real, but it was not the complete truth. And I have been aware of that incompleteness for 3 years without addressing it, which is its own kind of decision." She looked at him then. She let herself look fully, without the peripheral caution she had maintained for years. She said, "What was the complete truth?" He said, "You unsettled me. The way you saw things. The way you were in a room. I told myself letting the procedure run was neutral. But neutrality was a luxury I was taking at your expense, and I understood that at the time, and I chose the luxury anyway." The fire settled lower. Outside, a bird moved through the forest canopy, with a sound like a small decision being made. Rand sat with what he had said. She did not rush to respond, because this was not a moment that deserved a rushed response. She turned it over the way she turned over a piece of ground before she walked it, assessing it, finding its true level, understanding what it would take before she committed her next step to it. She said, "I know." 2 words, carrying the weight of 3 years and 15 years, and a mother's carefully taught lesson in a Tuesday morning and 11 hands and a cracked flagstone that had sealed itself in the second of her crossing. He heard all of it. She could see that he heard it. He said, "I am sorry, Ran." The use of her name again, this time chosen rather than spoken from the border of sleep. She felt it move through her the way warmth moved through stone, slowly, reaching depth before it reached surface. She said, "I know that too." On the 3rd morning, before the pale early light had fully committed to the day, she was outside checking the road's condition when she heard horses on the eastern approach, his escort, following the road's perfect surface toward the way station with the speed of people who had been searching for a day and a half and were running on relief and urgency in roughly equal measure. She heard him come to the way station door behind her. She heard the escort's lead rider call out, heard the organized relief of trained guards, finding their king alive and functional. She stood at the road's center, and she looked east at the section she had not yet finished laying. At the line she had surveyed and walked halfway, and then interrupted. And she felt the gift warming in her feet, asking to be used, asking to be walked forward. She heard him speak to his escort, calm, authoritative, giving instructions. The king's voice resettled into its full register, as naturally as a river resettles its banks after a flood. She heard him stop. She did not turn around. Behind her, She heard his footsteps cross the stone of the way station's threshold and stop at the road's edge. She heard him say, quietly enough that only she could hear it over the sounds of the escort's arrival, "I will come to find you. When things are clearer, I will come myself." She said nothing. She took one step forward on the unfinished road, and the ground answered her, and the stone formed beneath her heel, and she kept walking east without looking back. And the road extended itself behind her with every step. And behind her she heard his captain's voice, "The ring, Your Majesty. We found it on the road, outside the way station door." She heard the silence that followed. She did not stop walking. The map room was the coldest room in the palace. Caelen had never minded this. He had, over 12 years of kingship, developed a preference for rooms that did not encourage lingering, rooms where the business at hand remained the business at hand, where the architecture itself discouraged the kind of comfortable settling in that led to decisions made in warmth and ease, rather than in the clear-eyed chill of actual consequence. The map room was stone-floored and north-facing, and heated by a single brazier that he rarely lit. And it was where he came when he needed to think, without the insulation of comfort. He had been in it for 2 hours before his senior cartographer arrived. Master Aldous was a small, precise man who had served 3 kings, and who expressed his emotional states exclusively through the varying speeds of his movements. Baseline pace for neutral information, slightly faster for good news. And a particular measured deliberateness that Caelen had learned to recognize as the pace of a man carrying something he was not entirely sure how to put down. He entered the map room at that measured pace now, with a rolled survey under one arm and a leather document case under the other. And he spread the survey across the central table with the careful movements of someone handling something that mattered. The survey showed the entire kingdom. And across it, rendered in the cartographer's finest ink, was a network of roads that had not appeared on any survey 3 years ago. 23 of them, some short, a quarter-mile connecting a village track to the highway. Some extraordinary, a full 12-mile road cutting through the Drenath Gorge terrain that every engineer the Crown had ever commissioned had declared impassable, rendered now in the survey's perfect lines with the serene confidence of something that did not know it was supposed to be impossible. 47 villages. Caelen counted them the way he counted things that mattered. 47 places that had been, 3 years ago, effectively unreachable for the practical purposes of trade and supply and the basic infrastructure of a functioning society, now connected. The roads between them ran with the logic of someone who understood the land deeply and personally. Rather than from above, they did not take the straight-line routes that engineering surveys preferred. They curved. They followed the ground's own inclination. They found the paths that the land itself seemed to offer, and they made those paths permanent. He stood over the map for a long time without speaking. Master Aldous waited with the patience of a man who had spent 40 years in the company of kings thinking about maps. And then he said, "There is something else, Your Majesty." He opened the leather document case. Inside it, preserved between 2 sheets of thin pressing paper, was a wildflower. Small, dried, its color faded to a pale echo of whatever it had been when it was living, but its structure intact, 5 petals. A specific and identifiable variety that grew along the borderland road margins in late summer. Pressed with deliberate care, the kind of care you applied to something you intended to keep. Master Aldous said, "We found one at the beginning of each road. Always at the very first stone of the new surface. Pressed into a small gap between the stone and the road's edge marker. Always this same variety. Always in the same condition, fresh when the road was new, dried now. Our surveyors began collecting them when they realized the pattern." He paused. He said, "There is one more thing. I thought it might be irrelevant, but I find that I cannot stop thinking about it. And in my experience, things that one cannot stop thinking about are generally not irrelevant." He reached into the document case again and produced a second item, a ledger page. Not an original, a careful copy, made in the cartographer's own hand, of a record he had found in the palace's administrative archive. It was a household accounts entry from Lord Aldrich's estate, dating from 4 years ago. The entry itself was unremarkable: a supply correction, a vendor discrepancy, a fuel budget restructuring. Standard household accounting. What was not standard was the marker on the oldest page of the ledger. A pressed wildflower. noted in the archive copy because the original ledger's surveying cataloger had found it unusual enough to record. Small. 5 petals. The same specific borderland variety. Caelen looked at the ledger copy. He looked at the pressed flower from the road. He sat down in the map room's single chair, which he almost never did. And he looked at the map of 23 roads connecting 47 villages, and he felt the full weight of what he was looking at settle onto him with the completeness of something that had been true for a long time finally being fully apprehended. He had known in the way station forest. He had known when she moved through the small space with that particular economic efficiency. When she said I preferred alone to the alternative. When she did not flinch from his apology and did not offer him false absolution and said I know that too in a voice that carried the precise weight of 3 years. He had known, and he had held the knowing at arm's length, because arm's length was still a manageable distance. Still a distance from which a man could tell himself he was not yet certain. He was certain now. He sat in the coldest room in the palace, and he looked at the map of a kingdom that was significantly more alive than it had been 3 years ago, and he let himself understand. Without insulation or convenient procedure, or the comfortable luxury of a neutrality that had never been neutral. The exact shape of what he had failed to do, and what she had built in the space his failure had created. She had been voted out of a household. She had walked out of a hall with 11 hands raised and one that had not moved. And she had gone into exile with a small bundle and a pressed wildflower in a ledger and a gift no one had ever named or valued. And she had walked the kingdom's forgotten edges for 3 years. And the kingdom was 1/3 more prosperous because of it, and her name was on none of the records. And the only signature she had left was a wildflower at the start of each road, pressed into the stone like a quiet insistence on existing. He stayed in the map room for a long time after Master Aldous left. He looked at each road individually. He traced them with his finger across the survey's surface, following their curves, reading in them the logic of someone who listened to the ground rather than overriding it. He thought about a way station cottage in a borderland forest and a woman who heated water and checked a binding and said things that were true without making them weapons. He thought about 3 days and 2 chairs and a fire burning lower and the specific weight of the words I know that too. He thought about his ring, found on the road outside the way station door. He had put it back on. He was wearing it now. He looked at it. A knock at the map room door brought him back to the room's cold present. His head courier entered, slightly out of breath, carrying the particular expression of someone delivering information they were not sure was welcome. He said, "Your Majesty, the road woman has been located. She is currently building a road approximately 3 days' ride east of the palace, in the Marin Valley region." Caelen stood up from the chair. He looked at the map one more time. He found the Marin Valley. He found the road that was being built there. The new line his cartographers had marked in the week's most recent survey update, curving through the valley's eastern approach with the characteristic logic of someone who understood the land from the inside. He looked at where the road was going. It was heading in its long curved way toward the palace. All of the roads, he realized, standing in the cold map room with the survey spread before him and a pressed wildflower in a leather case and 3 years of his kingdom's growth mapped in lines that all belonged to one woman, all of them curved, in their various ways, back toward the center. As though she had never stopped moving toward something she had not been permitted to approach directly. As though the roads were not just infrastructure. As though they were also, in some patient and permanent and entirely characteristic way, a letter. He left the map room. He did not call for his full escort. The Marin Valley in late autumn was the kind of landscape that made a person understand why people had been writing poetry about impermanence for as long as there had been people and words to describe things with. The trees had given up most of their leaves, but not all of them. And the ones that remained held on with a quality that was less stubbornness than simple beauty, brilliant amber and deep copper against a sky that had committed fully to the particular gray of a season turning serious. The light coming in at the low angle of late-year afternoons that made everything it touched look considered, deliberate, worth examining before the dark came. The valley floor ran between 2 long ridges, and the eastern road she was building curved down from the northern ridge in a line that followed the valley's natural drainage. As all her roads did, working with the land rather than across it. Caelen found a place to tie his horse where the tree line thinned, and he stood there for a while before she noticed him. She was working the lower section of the road's approach to the valley floor. And she was not alone, 2 children from the nearest village. A boy and a girl of perhaps 8 and 10 were walking at a careful distance behind her, watching the road form beneath her heels with the absolute focused attention of people witnessing something they had decided was the most important thing they had ever seen. They were not interfering. They were not speaking to her. They had apparently established, through some prior negotiation, he had arrived too late to witness. An arrangement in which they were permitted to observe as long as they observed quietly. And they were honoring this arrangement with a seriousness that he found unexpectedly moving. He watched her work. She walked the line with a precision that was also, somehow, entirely natural, not the mechanical precision of someone following an external instruction, but the organic precision of someone whose body had made its own deep peace with what it was doing. Each step deliberate, each step a choice. The ground responded to her the way a conversation responded to someone who had learned to listen before they spoke, not immediately, not dramatically, but truly. The road forming behind each heel with the quiet completeness of something being made right rather than merely made. She was wearing her exile clothes, the practical, worn things of someone who had spent 3 years outdoors. Her hair was tied back, and her boots were the resoled ones he had noticed in the way station without knowing at the time why he was noticing them. And she carried herself with a quality that he had no better word for than presence. Not performance, not display, but the simple, undeniable fact of a person who had found out who they were and had stopped apologizing for it. He had told himself, riding the 3 days from the palace, that he was prepared for this. That he had spent sufficient time in the map room with the wildflowers and the trade reports and the honest accounting of his own failure to walk into this valley without being unmade by it. He had been wrong about that. She turned. She saw him before he moved or spoke, the way she had always had that quality of peripheral awareness that caught what rooms missed. And she went still in the way of someone who has encountered something they need a moment to assess before they decide what to do with it. Behind her, the 2 children stopped simultaneously, reading her stillness. And then they looked at the man at the tree line, and the older one took the younger one's hand with the instinctive protectiveness of a child who had learned early to be cautious about men who arrived unannounced. Caelen stepped away from the tree line. He had not brought his escort. He was dressed for travel, not for court. And without the architecture of his formal role, he was simply a man walking down a hillside toward a valley road, which was perhaps the most honest he had been in a very long time. He descended the slope carefully, aware of the gradient, aware of the 2 children watching him with the frank assessment of the very young, and he stopped at the road's edge. He stood before her. He did not speak immediately, because the immediate impulse was to reach for the formal language of courts and positions and considered statements. And he had made a decision on the 3rd day of riding that he was not going to do that. He had spent enough time in the language of procedure. He had spent enough time managing his way around the actual thing rather than saying the actual thing, and the actual thing deserved the actual words. He said ran. Not road woman, not the Omega, not any of the titles or non-titles that had been applied to her. Her name, said with the specific weight of a man who had been carrying it, unspoken, for 3 years. She did not move. She looked at him with those eyes that had always seen clearly, and she waited. And the valley was very quiet around them, and the 2 children behind her were perfectly still. He said, I know what you built. She said, very quietly, with a precision that carried no heat, but did not need to. I know what you didn't. The words were not a weapon. They were not delivered in anger, or with the particular sharpness of someone using truth to wound. They were delivered as fact, clean and level as one of her roads. And they landed with the force that only complete accuracy ever truly carries. He absorbed them. He said, yes, that is exactly right. A pause. The amber leaves moved in the slight valley wind. One of the children behind her shifted weight from one foot to the other, and the older one tightened her hand. He said, I read every road. All 23 of them. I read the trade reports and the village connection surveys and the poverty metrics. I traced every road on the map with my own hand. I understand what you did in 3 years, and I understand what it cost you to do it, and I understand that the cost was not something you should have been asked to carry. And I am standing here without my court and without my escort, because I wanted you to hear this from me as a man who made a specific failure and not as a king managing a political situation. She listened to all of it. She gave it the same patient, receiving attention she gave the ground before she walked it. She said, "What do you want, Caelen?" His name in her mouth, also for the first time chosen rather than accidental. He felt it. He said, "I want to be given the chance to be accurate going forward. In situations that ask for accuracy rather than convenience. I want to be given the chance to earn back whatever standing I had in your estimation before I chose a comfortable neutrality over a necessary action. I want," he paused, and she watched the pausing, the specific quality of a man choosing his next words with the care they deserved. "I want you to not have to build your roads in a direction that only curves towards something you were never permitted to approach directly." She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, the two children exchanged a glance of the deeply significant variety that children exchanged when adults were doing something the children found simultaneously baffling and important. She said, "You have the chance. I'm not in the business of refusing chances to people who ask accurately." She turned back to the road. She looked at the line she had been laying, assessed its next section, and she took a step forward. The ground answered her. She said, without turning around, "There is a village 2 miles east that has been waiting for this road for longer than you have been king. I intend to finish it before the light goes." He said, "May I walk with you?" A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. She said, "Stay on the road's edge. The gift needs the center line." He moved to the road's edge, and he walked beside her, a careful step behind and to the right. And the road extended itself in front of her with every step she took. And the two children fell in behind them both in the manner of a small and solemn procession. And the valley's amber light held them all in its low and considered glow. Then over the ridge behind them a rider appeared, moving fast, bearing colors that made Caelen's jaw tighten before the rider had covered half the distance. Thornvale colors. The Thornvale rider pulled up at the road's edge with the practiced insolence of someone who had been sent precisely because he was good at practiced insolence. Young, sharp-featured, wearing his faction's colors with the self-conscious deliberateness of a man who wanted to be noticed wearing them. He looked at Caelen with the particular careful blankness of a messenger who had been instructed to deliver his message regardless of the audience's reception. And then he looked at Ran with something less careful and less blank. The quick evaluative look of someone cataloging a variable he had not been briefed on. Ran cataloged him in return, once, with the efficiency she brought to everything. And then she looked back at the road and took another step. The stone formed beneath her heel. The rider addressed Caelen. The message was formal, delivered in the clipped language of official Thornvale correspondence, which was designed to sound like courtesy, while carrying the weight of a threat carefully padded in procedural language. The essence of it was this. The Thornvale Council had become aware of the Crown's interest in the so-called road network appearing in the borderland regions. The Council wished to formally register its position that any infrastructure built on land adjacent to Thornvale levied trade routes represented an economic incursion into territories under Thornvale commercial jurisdiction. The Council further wished to make clear that it was tracking the situation closely and expected a formal Crown response within 30 days. It was not, technically, a threat. It was the shape of a threat wearing a diplomatic cravat. Caelen listened to all of it without expression. Then he said, "Tell the Council that the Crown appreciates its correspondence and will respond through the appropriate formal channels." He said this in the specific tone he used for messages he intended to do absolutely nothing with. And the rider recognized the tone and chose to ignore it, which was also part of the practiced insolence. The rider looked at Ran again. He said, "And the builder? The Council will want to know her status." Caelen said, in a register that was quieter and therefore considerably more dangerous than the previous one, "The builder is a person of Crown interest. That is her status. Convey it precisely." The rider held the eye contact for a moment longer than was entirely wise, then turned and rode back over the ridge. Ran had not stopped walking. She was 12 steps further along the road by the time the rider crested the ridge and disappeared. The valley quiet again around the sounds of her footsteps, and the two children resuming their observation posts behind her, and the horses in the tree line shifting their weight. Caelen rejoined her at the road's edge, taking up his position again a careful step behind and to the right. and they walked in silence for a while, with the particular silence of two people processing the same event from different angles. Eventually she said, "Person of Crown Interest." He said, "It is the fastest available legal designation that confers protection without requiring a formal court proceeding." She said, "I notice you use the fastest available option rather than the most accurate one." He said, "What would the most accurate one be?" She said nothing. She walked another section of road and felt the ground answer her, and felt the thread beneath her sternum that she had been refusing to name for 3 years pull with its quiet insistence. And she decided, standing in a valley in the amber afternoon light of her third autumn in exile, that she had been patient with herself long enough on the subject of naming things accurately. She said, "You know what the most accurate designation is? You said my name in your sleep in a fever. People do not say names like that in fevers unless those names mean something specific." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him breathe. He said, "I know what it means. I have known what it means since before the vote. Longer than that." She said, "And?" He said, "And I did not act on it because acting on a bond with a woman in a position of household service in my own court felt like an abuse of the power differential. And I told myself that was the reason I stayed silent, and it was a real reason, and it was also, as I have been learning lately, to acknowledge about my real reasons, not the only one." She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him fully. The direct, complete look she had given him in the way station, and that she gave him now with the same honest economy. She said, "What was the other reason?" He met her eyes. He said, "You were the most unsettling person in every room you were in. Not in a way that anyone else could have identified or described. In the specific way of someone who sees clearly and says nothing, which is the most powerful position available to a person with no formal power, and I did not know what to do with that. And so I did nothing and called it neutrality." She held his gaze for a long moment. She said, "The bond is real. I have known it was real for as long as you have. I spent 3 years walking it out of myself, and it walked back in every time, and I have stopped pretending otherwise. But a bond is not a decision. It is a fact. The decision is what you do with the fact." He said, "What would you need from me for the decision to be possible?" She thought about this. She thought about it with the same patience she brought to ground assessment before she walked it, honestly, without rushing to a comfortable answer. She said, "I would need you to raise your hand. Not in a court where it costs you nothing. In a room where it costs you something real. I would need to see the shape of your choice when the choice is inconvenient." He said, "I understand." She turned back to the road. She walked forward, and the ground answered, and behind her he walked at the road's edge, and the afternoon light carried them both in its amber, and the bond ran between them like a road that had always been there, waiting for two people to walk the same direction at the same time. That night they sat at the edge of the half-finished road on the valley's lower slope, a lantern between them. The darkness of the Marin Valley spread out below, and the sky overhead doing what autumn skies did best, filling itself with more stars than seemed strictly necessary, as though making an argument for the existence of things that were beautiful without being useful. Ran was reviewing her survey notes. He was looking at the stars. The two children had gone home at dusk with the reluctance of people leaving something they did not want to end, and the quiet that remained after them was a companionable one. He reached out and placed his hand on the road surface beside him. It was warm. Not from the air, which had cooled with the dark. From something else. The residual warmth of her passing. Held in the stone the way stone held all the things it was asked to hold, indefinitely, without complaint. He said, "It's warm." She looked at where his hand rested on the road. She said, "It remembers where I have been." He said, "It has been 3 years of being remembered in stone." She said, "The stone does not mind." He left his hand where it was. She looked at her survey notes, and then she looked at his hand on the warm stone, and she felt the thread between them settle into something that was neither the old ache of 3 years' distance nor the dangerous pull of the way station fever night, but something steadier and more architectural, something that felt, she thought, like the beginning of a road being built in the right direction. She did not move toward him. He did not move toward her. But neither of them moved away. At dawn, when the courier arrived bearing the palace seal, and the news that the High Court had called an emergency session with Ran as its subject, she was already awake, already watching the eastern sky lighten over the valley ridge, already understanding. With the calm of someone who had spent 3 years becoming exactly who she was, that the next road she needed to walk ran directly back toward the place she had walked out of. She folded her survey notes. She stood up. She said, "Then we go back." The palace looked the same. This was the first thing Rand noticed as they rode through the main gates on the 4th morning after leaving the Marin Valley, that the palace looked entirely unchanged. Its pale stone walls and formal towers, and the careful geometry of its entrance courtyard all exactly as she had left them 3 years ago, which seemed wrong in the way that all unchanged things seemed wrong when the person returning to them had changed completely. The courtyard cobblestones caught the morning light with the same indifferent beauty they had always had. The guards at the gate stood in the same positions. The palace flags moved in the same direction as the wind they had always followed. Only the road leading to the main gate was different. Rand noticed this with a quiet satisfaction she did not permit herself to express outwardly. The approach road, the final mile of the King's Highway running to the palace entrance, had been one of her earliest roads. Late in the first weeks of exile, when she was still learning the full reach of her gift, and was walking the highway sections near the capital with the careful anonymity of someone who had not yet decided how large she intended her footprint to be. The road was perfect now. It had been perfect for 3 years. Every cart that arrived at the palace, every messenger, every dignitary, every supply delivery had traveled the last mile of their journey on a surface she had made. Without knowing it, without her name attached to it. The benefit flowing silently from a source no one had thought to credit. She rode over it now with her name intact. The court had assembled in the great hall by the time they arrived, which told her that the session had been called with sufficient urgency, that the normal procedural delays of gathering a full noble court had been compressed. Lord Aldrich's faction would have had 2 days to prepare their legal motion, which was enough time for a man who had been preparing contingency motions for 3 years of watching roads appear on maps he could not explain. She did not underestimate this. She had balanced Lord Aldrich's household accounts for 4 years. She understood exactly how his mind worked when it was working in its own interest. Caelen walked beside her through the palace corridors. He did not touch her. He did not need to. The fact of his presence, arriving together, riding in from the same direction, the court having been informed by his advance messenger that the king was returning with the road woman, was its own statement. And every person they passed in the corridor read it with the speed of people who had been trained from birth in the language of proximity and implication. The great hall opened before them. Rand stopped in the doorway for one breath. She had stood in this room before. She had stood in its center while hands rose around her, and she had walked out through its door. And the door's flagstone had sealed itself beneath her heel, and she had not looked back. She had thought, in the 3 years since, that if she ever returned to this room, it would feel like something that needed to be survived. An ordeal with the geography. It did not feel like that. It felt like a room. Stone walls and candelabras and faces arranged in the careful social architecture of people who had been told something important was about to happen and had positioned themselves accordingly. Some near the front, some near the walls, some in the elevated gallery that ran along the hall's northern side. The same high seat at the far end. The same cold light coming through the tall windows. The faces were different from 3 years ago. Some were the same faces in different configurations. Lord Aldrich in the front position to the left. His faction arranged around him with the practiced casualness of people who had agreed on their positions before they walked in. The High Steward at the procedural lectern. Several faces she did not recognize. Newer members of the court who had arrived in the 3 years of her absence and who looked at her now with pure assessment, uncontaminated by the memory of what she had been before because they had no before to reference. She walked in. She did not walk to the center of the room where she had stood before. She walked to a position slightly to the right of center, which was a small thing, and also not a small thing. She was not standing where they had put her. She was standing where she chose to stand. Caelen moved to the high seat. The High Steward called the session to order with the formulaic language of a man who had called hundreds of sessions to order and had learned to make the formula feel like gravity, inevitable, impersonal, simply the way things worked. The motion was read. Lord Aldrich's faction had been thorough. The legal argument was constructed in 4 parts. each interlocking with the next in the manner of a carefully built wall. First, that the roads had been built on crown and noble land without authorization. Second, that any gift exercised on crown land was, by the kingdom's foundational property statutes, subject to crown claim. Third, that the woman who had exercised this gift was therefore bound to crown service under the terms of the gift use statute. Fourth, and most critically, that her previous removal from noble household service constituted a formal record establishing her lack of independent standing in any proceeding of this court. It was well constructed. She had to grant him that. She stood and listened to it the way she listened to the ground before she walked it, fully, without flinching, understanding its actual contours rather than the contours she would have preferred it to have. She noted the specific shape of each argument, where it was solid and where, if you knew where to look, the foundation was thinner than it appeared. The gift use statute was the weakest section. It had been written 400 years ago to address a specific situation involving a water-shaping gift and a disputed irrigation claim. And its language, when read precisely rather than broadly, did not cleanly cover the situation Lord Aldrich was attempting to apply it to. She had read it in a village elder's copy of the kingdom's legal codex in her second year of exile. She had read it twice. She had not planned to be in this room, but she had apparently been preparing for it anyway. The motion concluded. The High Steward moved toward the procedural language of calling a vote. In the gallery above, a face she had not seen in 3 years looked down at her. Lady Mira, Lord Aldrich's niece, who had once looked directly through her in a corridor. Lady Mira was not looking through her now. She was watching with an expression that Rand could not fully read from this distance, but that carried in it something that was not hostility, something closer, perhaps, to the particular attention of a person watching something they had not expected and were still deciding what to think about. The High Steward's voice shaped the formal words of the vote's opening. Rand looked at the high seat. Caelen rose. The room stilled the way rooms stilled when a king chose to make an unexpected physical gesture. The quiet that fell not from respect alone, but from the animal awareness of power deciding to show itself. He said, "Before the vote proceeds, I will speak." Lord Aldrich's jaw set with the controlled precision of a man who had anticipated this and had decided that anticipating it was sufficient preparation for it. The High Steward paused. Caelen began to speak, and Rand listened, and the great hall listened, and the candelabras threw their gold light across faces that were, for the first time in her experience of this room, turned entirely toward the front rather than toward each other. And then Lord Aldrich rose, and the room changed. Caelen spoke for 11 minutes. Rand counted, because counting was what she did when she needed to stay grounded in the present rather than the past, and the present required grounding. He spoke with the careful precision of a man who had spent 3 days writing and 2 hours in a map room, and an honest accounting of himself assembling the argument he was now making. And it was a good argument, legally sound, procedurally accurate, delivered in the measured register of a king who understood that a court responded to authority expressed through mastery of its own language rather than simply through volume or emotion. He challenged the motion on procedural grounds. He cited the gift use statute directly, its original context, its specific language, the 400-year gap between the situation it was written to address and the situation Lord Aldrich was attempting to apply it to. He noted that the Crown had no record of authorizing the use of the statute in this manner, and that applying it now would create a legal precedent with implications far beyond the immediate case. He moved that the vote be suspended pending a formal review of the statute's applicability by the kingdom's legal scholars. It was well done. It was genuinely, technically well done. The High Steward nodded. The procedural language of suspension was invoked. The vote was delayed. The room breathed. And Rand stood in her chosen position slightly right of center, and she listened to the suspension being declared, and she felt, moving through her with the specific quality of something she had felt before and recognized immediately, the particular shape of a protection that operated by making the immediate danger recede, rather than by addressing the thing that had created the danger in the first place. He had stopped the vote. He had not said her name as a free person. He had not said, "This woman built these roads, and she owns her gift, and no statute old or new can claim what belongs to her." He had not said, "What was done 3 years ago in this room was wrong, and I was part of its wrongness by my silence, and I will not be silent in that way again. He had said, the legal mechanism being invoked requires closer examination. He had said, let us pause and review. He had spoken in the language of courts and procedure, and he had done it skillfully, and it had worked, and it was not enough. She had known, standing in the Marin Valley and telling him what she would need, a hand raised in a room where raising it cost something real, that the cost had a specific shape. She understood now, standing in the great hall with the vote suspended on procedural grounds, that procedural suspension was not the shape. Lord Aldrich rose. He was a controlled man. Ran had observed him for 4 years, and she had never seen him lose control. Because he was the kind of man who understood that control was the primary tool of power for someone who could not rely on being the most intelligent or most physically formidable person in a room. He was not stupid. She had never made the mistake of thinking him stupid. He was strategic in the specific way of someone who had been building toward a particular arrangement of pieces for a long time and was not prepared to have them moved by a procedural suspension. He said, in his careful measured voice, Your Majesty, I respect the procedural caution you are exercising. However, I would ask the court to note that the procedural suspension does not address the fundamental question before us. The question is not only which statute applies. The question is whether a person of no formal standing, no household record, and no court-recognized position has the right to exercise a kingdom-altering gift on crown land without authorization, and to be present in this court as though that exercise confers standing rather than obligation. The suspension delays the vote. It does not resolve the question. He paused. He looked at Ran with the evaluative directness of a man who had spent 4 years looking through her and was now looking at her, which was its own kind of information about how much had changed. He said, I would further note that the previous vote of removal from my household constitutes a standing court record. That record has not been challenged, overturned, or formally addressed. It exists. It speaks to her standing, or the absence of it, in any proceeding of this court. The room absorbed this. Ran absorbed it. She felt it land with the specific weight of something that had been waiting in the architecture of her situation since she walked back through the palace gates. Something she had seen clearly and had been preparing for in the way she prepared for everything, not by pretending it was not there, but by understanding its exact dimensions before she needed to navigate it. She looked at the high seat. Caelen looked back at her. And she read his face with 4 years and 3 years and every careful hour of peripheral attention she had ever given him. And she read in it the thing she had been watching for since the Marin Valley. The cost. He was calculating the cost of the next step, the step beyond procedural suspension. The step that would require him to speak not in the language of legal review, but in the language of direct moral clarity. The language that could not be reversed or reviewed or walked back through a subsequent procedural motion. He was calculating what dismantling the vote record would cost him with Lord Aldrich's faction, which was the second largest power block in his court and which controlled significant portions of the northern trade routes, and which would not absorb a direct royal challenge to a noble house's voting record without consequence. He was not wrong to calculate this. The cost was real. She watched him calculate it, and she understood, with the clean, specific clarity of a woman who had spent 3 years becoming exactly who she was, that she was not going to wait for the calculation's outcome. Not because she had given up on him, she had not, but because she had promised herself. Standing on a hillside above Marin's Crossing and telling a small girl I did, that she was done waiting for other people's decisions to determine her standing. She would determine it herself. That night, after the session had closed and the court had dispersed into its various factions and conversations and political recalibrations, she went to the map room alone. She stood at the table where the survey was still spread, the 23 roads rendered in fine ink across the kingdom's face, and she looked at every one of them. She traced them the way Caelen had traced them, she supposed. Though she did not need a map to know their courses, she knew them from the inside, from the specific feel of each one under her feet, from the memory of the ground's response at every section where the land had been difficult and the gift had needed to reach deeper. She knew what she needed to do. The right of the road's end existed for one purpose: to allow a gift-bearer to permanently bind their gift to the kingdom's foundation. establishing through the most ancient and irrefutable of the kingdom's ceremonial mechanisms a standing that no court vote and no statute and no noble house record could override. It was not a legal proceeding. It was older than the legal proceedings. It predated the court. It predated the kingdom's current name, and it had never been survived by an Omega. She had known about it since her second year of exile, when an old woman in a borderland village had pressed a hand-copied section of the kingdom's oldest ceremonial record into her hands and said, "This was written for someone like you. Long before you were born. Someone knew you were coming." She had carried the copied pages in her ledger since then, behind the pressed wildflower on the oldest page. She took them out now and read them again in the map room's cold light. And she understood every word, and she understood what they would ask of her. And she sat with that understanding for a long time without flinching away from it. Then she opened the ledger to a clean page. She wrote, in her small precise handwriting, a formal request addressed to the high priest of the kingdom's oldest temple. She cited the ceremonial record. She named her gift. She named herself, not the Omega, not the road woman, not the person of crown interest. She wrote her full name, the name her mother had given her, the name that meant, in the old borderland language, she who moves forward. She folded the letter. She sealed it. She walked to the door of the map room, and she found, as she had expected she would, one of the palace's night couriers standing in the corridor outside with the quiet readiness of someone who had been told the room might produce correspondence that needed moving before dawn. She handed him the letter. He looked at the address. Something moved across his face, recognition perhaps, or the particular reverence of a young person encountering the name of a place older than anything else in the kingdom. He said, "Tonight, my lady?" She said, "Before dawn." He went. She stood in the map room doorway for a moment, her hand on the frame. The survey visible behind her with its 23 roads and its 47 villages and its pressed wildflower in a leather case. She thought of her mother. She thought of the small girl on the hillside above Marin's Crossing, who had asked who built that road with the directness of someone who had not yet learned that some questions were not supposed to be asked. She thought, "I did." Then she went to prepare. The high priest's name was Edrin, and he had been tending the kingdom's oldest temple for 31 years. And in 31 years he had received exactly one formal request to undertake the rite of the road's end. And that request had come from a nobleman whose gift had been a minor stone-shaping ability that would not have survived the rite's first quarter mile. And Edrin had counseled him strongly against it, and the nobleman had eventually agreed. And Edrin had thought at the time that he would likely never receive another such request in his lifetime. He read Rant's letter twice in the gray pre-dawn of his study, his tea cooling beside him. His expression passing through surprise and assessment, and something that settled finally into a quality she would have recognized if she had been there to see it. The look of a man encountering something he had been half expecting for a long time without knowing he was expecting it. He sent his reply before the sun cleared the eastern wall. He granted the request. The preparation period was 3 days, which was what the ceremonial record specified, and which Ran had expected. And she used them in the way she used every period of time that mattered, completely without waste, without the comfortable self-deception of pretending there was more time than there was. On the first day she walked. Not a new road. She walked, in memory and in body where body was possible, every road she had ever built. She began with the oldest, the section of King's Highway near Lord Aldrich's estate, which she visited on foot in the early morning before the road's regular traffic began, walking its smooth surface with her hand trailing along the edge where the gift's permanent warmth still lived in the stone 3 years later. She thought about who she had been when she laid it, a woman who had just walked out of a hall and had not yet understood what she was carrying, a woman who knew the shape of her mother's lesson better than she knew her own face. She moved through each road in sequence. Some she could only visit in memory. The Drenath Gorge Road was 3 days' ride east, and the time did not permit the journey, but she found that memory was sufficient. The gift had encoded every road in her the way stone encoded warmth, permanently at depth, available to be recalled not as image, but as sensation. She remembered the feel of the Drenath ground under her feet, the resistance it had offered, and the way the gift had reached deeper than it ever had before, finding something ancient in that rock that had responded to her intention like a tuning fork responding to its matched note. She remembered the first village road. The second. The way the ground's response had grown more fluent as her confidence in the gift grew. The way confidence and gift had fed each other in the 3 years of exile until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. By the end of the first day, she had accounted for all 23 roads. She sat in her palace room. She had been given a room, quietly, without fanfare, by the palace's head of household. A woman who had looked at her with the expression of someone correcting a long-standing administrative error, and she held the full weight of what she had built in the interior of herself. Not proudly, not with self-congratulation, simply as an accurate accounting. This is what I did. This is what it cost. This is what it made. On the second day, Caelen found her. She was in the palace courtyard, the old courtyard, the one with the cobblestones she had smoothed without knowing it in 4 years of daily crossing. It was evening. The courtyard was empty of everyone else, lit by the particular blue-gray light of a sky that had not yet decided between day and dark. She was sitting on the low stone bench at the courtyard's eastern edge, and she was not doing anything, which was unusual enough for her that he stopped in the courtyard entrance and looked at her for a moment before he walked in. He sat beside her, not close enough to press, not far enough to pretend he was not making a choice about proximity. Beside her, the way she had asked him to walk beside her on the road, present, not overriding. She was looking at the cobblestones. After a while he looked at them too, and then he looked more carefully. And she watched him see it, the smoothness of her path across the courtyard. The 4 years of daily crossing recorded permanently in stone. Her presence documented in the one language that could not be denied or voted out or declared procedurally suspended. He said quietly, "How many places in this palace carry this?" She said, "Every path I walked regularly. The accounts corridor. The kitchen passage. The section of the main staircase between the 3rd and 4th steps where I always slowed my pace. Because the riser was slightly higher than standard, and I did not want to make noise early in the morning." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You have been here in every stone for 4 years. She said, "The stone does not make distinctions about who is supposed to be counted." He reached for her hand. She let him take it, the way she had let him take it on the 3rd night in the way station. And they sat together in the blue-gray courtyard light with the smooth cobblestones beneath them and the gift living quietly in the stone all around them. Patient, permanent, entirely indifferent to the opinions of courts. He said, "I should have raised my hand." She said, "You will have more chances." He said, "Will you tell me what the right asks of you?" She considered. She said, "It asks me to walk the oldest road in the kingdom, in darkness, alone, while it falls apart behind every step. I cannot stop. I cannot look back. The gift must respond without my being able to see what it is doing or whether it is working. At the end, if I reach the end, the bond between my gift and the kingdom's foundation becomes permanent and irrevocable and legally prior to any statute or court record. It cannot be voted on. It cannot be suspended. It simply is." He said, "What happens if you don't reach the end?" She said, "No one has ever not reached the end, because no one with a foundational gift has ever attempted it. The record does not specify what happens. It says only that the road will know." He did not ask her not to do it. She had thought he might, and she had prepared a response. And she was glad she did not need to use it, because the response would have been kind but firm, and she did not want this evening to require firmness. He did not ask her not to do it, because he understood her well enough to know that asking her not to walk a road was approximately as useful as asking the road not to hold her. He held her hand and she let him hold it, and the palace's evening quiet settled around them like something that had learned, finally, to include her. At some point the darkness became full, and the stars appeared, and they were still sitting there, not speaking, not needing to speak. The cobblestones beneath their feet carrying 4 years of her presence in their smoothed and settled surfaces. Far across the city, in the oldest temple's deepest chamber, the high priest Edrin was making his own preparations. He was lighting the ceremonial lamps that had not been lit in living memory. He was reading the oldest sections of the ceremonial record aloud to himself in the careful cadent manner of someone reminding the words of their own meaning. He was thinking about the woman who had sent the letter before dawn, and about the hand-copied pages she had cited with the precision of someone who had been studying them for years. and about the sentence in the record's opening passage that he had read 31 years ago and had never found the right context for. The sentence read, "The road does not ask who is worthy. The road asks only who will walk." The temple bells had not rung since his predecessor's time. At dawn they began to ring. The oldest road in the kingdom had no name. It existed beneath the palace, which had been built over it rather than through it. Because even the architects of the kingdom's founding had understood that some things predated their authority and should be worked around rather than erased. It ran in a straight line under the palace's eastern foundations, a tunnel of sorts. Though tunnel was not quite right, because a tunnel implied something carved out of existing stone, and this was something different. This was stone that had arranged itself. In some period so distant that the kingdom's oldest records referred to it only as before, into a passage that was also a road. Its surface worn smooth by feet so ancient and so numerous that the smoothness itself had become a kind of geological record. The accumulated intention of generations pressing permanently into stone. It was 60 yards long. In the ordinary sense, 60 yards was nothing. Ran had walked 60 yards in less time than it took to draw a full breath. She had walked 12-mile roads through gorged terrain and not counted the distance. 60 yards in a straight line was not a physical challenge. The ceremonial record was specific about what made it otherwise. The road's surface, during the rite, would respond to the walker's gift rather than to the walker's feet, meaning that each step would activate the passage's ancient stone, and the ancient stone would test the gift by doing the opposite of what her gift did in the ordinary world. Instead of hardening and settling beneath her, the road would fracture and fall away behind each step, the surface crumbling as though her passage were undoing it rather than making it. She would be walking on stone that was disintegrating in her wake, which the record noted was the sensation, more than any physical difficulty, that had caused every previous aspirant to stop. Not the darkness, though the rite was performed in complete darkness, and the lamps were extinguished the moment the walker crossed the threshold. Not the physical demand, though the record noted that the passage generated a cold that went deeper than air temperature. A cold that the record described as the cold of deep time. The chill of stone that had been undisturbed for so long that it carried in it the memory of a world before warmth was common. The stopping point was always the sensation of destruction at your heels. The sensation of your gift being turned backward, of each step unmaking rather than making, of the road falling away behind you into darkness, leaving you standing on the last solid stone with nothing behind you, and the next stone already beginning to fracture, and only the darkness ahead. The record said, the walker must understand that the destruction is not real. The road tests the gift by simulating its inverse. But the gift does not feel the simulation. The gift feels the destruction as absolute fact. And the walker must walk forward on the strength of their intention alone, without the confirmation of solid ground forming behind them, in complete darkness, for 60 yards. Ran read this passage 11 times in 3 days of preparation. She did not read it to talk herself out of being afraid of it. She was afraid of it. She had been afraid of it in an honest and precise way since she first read the record in her second year of exile. And she saw no value in performing bravery about a thing that deserved the respect of honest fear. She read it to understand it completely, because understanding something completely was the only preparation for it that she trusted. She crossed the temple threshold at dawn. High Priest Edrin met her in the outer chamber with the gravity of a man for whom gravity was not a performance but a natural state, a man shaped by 31 years of tending things older than he could fully comprehend. He spoke the ceremonial opening, his voice carrying the particular resonance of words that had been spoken so many times in the same space that they had become part of the space's acoustics. He anointed her wrists with oil from a lamp that had not been lit in a generation. He asked her, in the formal language of the record, to name her gift. She said, "I lay roads. Wherever I walk with intention, the ground becomes what a road is supposed to be." He asked, "And what is a road supposed to be?" She said, "Permanent. Connecting. A path from where something is to where it needs to go." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, departing from the ceremonial script in the way of a man who had something to say that the script had not anticipated. "The road will try to convince you that you are destroying rather than building. Your gift will feel it as truth. The only answer to that feeling is the thing you know to be truer. Have you found what that is?" She said, without hesitation, yes. He stepped aside. The passage door opened. The darkness inside it was not the ordinary darkness of an unlit room. It was the darkness of deep stone. The kind of darkness that had no relationship with light, because light had never been its context. It was absolute and cold, and it pressed against her eyes with the weight of very old patience. She could see nothing. She could feel the threshold stone beneath her feet, and the cold air moving against her face, and the gift warming in her soles with the particular quality of readiness that she had come to recognize. Over 3 years as the gift's version of attention, it knew where it was. It knew what was being asked. She stepped in. The door closed behind her. For the first 4 steps, nothing was different from any road she had ever walked. The ground responded. The gift flowed downward through her feet, and the ancient stone answered, settling and solidifying with the deep resonant quality of stone that was very old and very ready. And she thought, perhaps the record overstated it. Perhaps for a gift as fully realized as hers the simulation would not be. The 5th step. Behind her 4th step, the stone fell away. Not gradually, not ambiguously. The sound of it was absolute in the darkness, the sharp fracture of stone giving way. The cascade of pieces falling into a depth she could not see, and did not want to calculate. The echo of destruction ringing off the passage walls, and then silence. Complete silence. The kind of silence that followed something irrevocable. She stood on the 4th step stone, and felt the gift beneath her feet recoil. The gift felt the destruction behind her as absolute fact. She felt it as the loss of every road she had ever built, not as image or concept but as sensation. The specific physical memory of each road reversed, the Dranath Gorge crumbling, the Marin Valley approach falling into mud. The first section of King's Highway, near Lord Aldrich's estate, fracturing along the diagonal crack that she had sealed on the morning of the vote. She felt it all at once. The unmaking of 3 years pressed into a single second of absolute physical conviction. She stopped. Not in her feet. Her feet were still on the 4th stone, still standing. But in the gift. The gift had seized in the way of something confronted with the inversion of its own nature. She stood in the darkness and the cold of deep time, and she breathed. First breath, what is true? What was true was that the roads had not fallen. What was true was that 47 villages were still connected. That the Dranath Gorge Road was carrying grain this morning. That the Marin Valley approach was being walked right now by farmers and children, and people whose lives had changed because she had walked it. What was true was that stone remembered. What was true was that the destruction behind her was a test, and tests were, by their nature, not the same as the thing they tested for. Second breath, what is needed? What was needed was 1 step. The next one. Onto a stone she could not see, toward a destination she could not see. Through a darkness that would not confirm her and could not be asked to. 1 step taken on the strength of what she knew rather than what she could verify. Third breath, what will you do? She thought of her mother, standing in Lord Fenwick's receiving room with her spine straight and her hands folded, absorbing a verdict that was wrong without a tool to fight it with. She thought of the small girl on the hillside above Marin's Crossing. She thought of village children walking on stone roads they had never known was a wish pressed into the earth. She thought of a warm stone surface in the Marin Valley darkness, holding the memory of where she had been. She thought, the road does not ask who is worthy. The road asks only who will walk. She took the 5th step. Behind the 5th step, the stone fell away. She took the 6th. She did not stop counting, but she stopped tracking the destruction because the destruction was not the point, and had never been the point, and she understood now, in the full physical immediacy of a 60-yard passage in absolute darkness, that the preparation had worked. That the 11 readings of the passage had given her exactly what Edrin had asked about, the thing she knew to be truer than the simulation of loss. She walked. At step 30, the midpoint, where the record said the passage was most broken and the ancient stone's resistance most acute, she fell. Not a stumble. Her foot met a section of the passage floor where the ancient stone had been genuinely fractured by age and deep time rather than by the right simulation. A section that even her gift could not instantly compensate for. And her knee went down onto stone and her hand went out, and she was on the passage floor in the cold and the dark with the gift screaming in her bones and the sound of stone falling away in every direction around her. She breathed. She thought of every name her roads had connected to every other name. She put her hand flat on the passage floor. The floor was warm beneath her palm. Her own warmth, coming back to her from the stone she had already laid in passing. The road was holding where she had walked it. The destruction was behind the holding, yes, she could hear it, but the holding was also real, and it was hers. And it was ahead of her too in the stone that had not yet been walked and was waiting. She stood up. She walked the remaining 30 yards without stopping. She walked them with the same deliberate steadiness she had walked every road she had ever built, not faster because she was afraid, not slower because she was tired, but at the pace of intention, the pace of someone who had decided where they were going and was going there. The end of the passage was a door. She pushed it open. The light was enormous, not just because she had been in darkness, because the room beyond the passage was the temple's central chamber, and every ceremonial lamp in it had been lit. And they burned with the particular intensity of things that had been waiting a long time to be useful. And the light they made was the warmest light she had ever stood in. She stood in it and breathed. And then she felt it. It began beneath her feet, a tremor, not violent, not frightening, but vast. A tremor that ran outward from where she stood through the passage floor, and through the temple foundation, and through the palace foundation above it, and outward through the earth beneath the city, and outward further. Following the lines she had walked, traveling through 23 roads in every direction at once. She felt it in her soles the way she felt all roads, as a living response. The earth recognizing her, the foundation of the kingdom acknowledging what had been laid in it. In the palace map room, the survey pinned to the central table trembled. On the King's Highway 3 miles east, a cartographer checking road conditions felt the ground beneath him hum once, deeply, like a bell struck from below. In 47 villages, in the first stone of each of her roads, the wildflower impression she had pressed into the beginning of every surface blazed briefly warm, and then settled, permanent as always, but different now, deeper, as though the warmth had found its way all the way down to the kingdom's oldest layer and been recognized there. Every road in the kingdom trembled. Every single one. Rand stood in the temple's burning light with the warmth of deep stone rising through her feet, and she felt the bond between her gift and the kingdom's foundation seal itself with the quiet completeness of something that had always been true and had now simply become irrevocable. High Priest Edrin stood at the chamber's far end. He looked at her across the light. He said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "It has been 1,000 years since the foundation answered." She said, "It was waiting for the right road." She did not go to the great hall immediately. She went first to the palace's washing room, and she cleaned the passage dust from her hands and her knees and her face with the methodical care of someone who understood that what came next required her to be entirely present and entirely herself. Not the residue of the rite's darkness still clinging to her skin. She changed into clean clothes, not the gray of a household serving woman, not the travel-worn practicality of 3 years' exile, but a deep brown that was the color of the borderland earth in autumn. A color she had bought in a village market in her second year, and had been carrying since then in the bottom of her pack for a reason she had not fully articulated to herself until this morning. She looked at herself in the washing room's small mirror. She had not done this deliberately in a long time. There had been no mirrors in the way station. There had been no particular reason to look in the villages. She looked now with the honest and impersonal assessment she brought to everything, reading what the mirror told her the way she read anything that told the truth without adjusting it for comfort. She looked like someone who had walked 60 yards through the deepest dark of a kingdom's foundation and had come out the other side still standing. She looked like someone who had been building roads for 3 years and had the posture and the hands to prove it. She looked, she thought, like exactly who she was, and who she was had been earned at a cost that deserved to be visible rather than managed into palatability. She put the pressed wildflower from her ledger into the breast pocket of the brown dress. Then she walked to the great hall. The session had been called at Caelen's request, following the report of the rite's completion that High Priest Edrin had sent to the palace before dawn. The court had assembled with the speed of a body that understood something seismic had occurred and was uncertain how to position itself relative to the seismic event. Rand could feel this uncertainty as she entered, the particular quality of a room that had been very confident about the rules, and had just received information suggesting the rules had been rewritten. At a level deeper than the room's authority extended. Good, she thought. Let them feel uncertain. Uncertainty was more honest than the confidence they had brought to the vote 3 years ago. The room was full. Lords and ladies and their advisors arranged in the galleries and along the walls, the high steward at his lectern. Caelen at the high seat, with the particular stillness of a man who had made decisions in the night and was prepared to stand behind them. She noted Lord Aldrich in his front left position, his faction around him, his face carrying the controlled precision of someone who had prepared for multiple contingencies and was now assessing which one had arrived. Ran walked to the center of the room. She did not wait to be addressed. She said, "I will speak now," and the room stilled. Her voice was not loud. It had never needed to be loud because it had always been precise. And precision at the right moment carried further than volume in the wrong one. The room heard her the way rooms heard things that were said with complete conviction, not because of the sound but because of the weight behind it. She said, "My name is Ran. I was born in the borderlands to an Omega healer named Sela. I served in Lord Aldrich's household for 4 years, and I was voted out of it 3 years ago by a procedure designed not for justice but for erasure. I walked out of this hall through that door, and I did not ask permission from anyone on my way through it." She paused. She reached into the breast pocket of her brown dress, and she took out a folded document. Not the pressed wildflower. Not yet, but the Crown's own trade report, the most recent one, which she had obtained from the palace's administrative office that morning with the particular authority of someone whose gift had just been permanently bonded to the kingdom's foundation, and who felt entirely comfortable walking into administrative offices and asking for documents. She said, "This is the Crown's Trade and Development Report for the past 3 years. I am going to read from it." She read. She did not read selectively. She read the sections that her roads appeared in. Each reference to improved infrastructure and village connectivity and trade route access and poverty reduction. She read the numbers, the specific ones. The ones that told the story in the language that courts respected most, the language of measurable consequence. She read the cartographer's notations, the surveyor's assessments. She read the section that said, in the carefully neutral language of official documentation, that the source of the road network remained unattributed. Then she put the report down and she said, "This kingdom was built, in part, by a woman you voted out. Not metaphorically, materially, measurably. In stone that has been permanently bonded to this kingdom's foundation since this morning at dawn. Those roads did not exist before I walked them. They will not cease to exist because of anything this court decides. They are in the earth. They are in the foundation. They are, by the legal definition established by the right of the road's end, and confirmed by High Priest Edrin this morning, prior to any court record, any noble house vote, any statute of gift use or property or standing that this court has the authority to invoke." She looked around the room. She said, "I did not ask for your permission to build them. I will not ask for your permission now. I am not standing in the center of this room because I am waiting for another vote. I am standing in the center of this room because this is where the road leads, and I walk where the road leads. I built the roads that connect the forgotten edges of this kingdom to its center. I built them in exile. I built them alone. I built them because the need existed and I had the gift, and the only permission that mattered was the permission of the ground, which gave it freely every time I asked." The hall was silent with a silence different from any silence Ran had experienced in it before. Not the silence of a room waiting for the next procedural step. Not the silence of a room that had made its decision and was waiting for the losing party to accept it. This was the silence of a room that was thinking. That was, perhaps for the first time, genuinely thinking about what it had done and what it was looking at and what those two things meant when placed beside each other. She took the pressed wildflower from her breast pocket. She held it up. She said, "I pressed one of these into the beginning of every road I built, because I wanted there to be a signature, because I understood that my name would not be attached to the work in any official record, and I wanted the work to know who had done it even if the record did not. The roads know, the ground knows, and now so does this court." She put the wildflower back. She said, "I am done speaking. I invite the court to respond." The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then Caelen rose from the high seat. He did not look at her immediately. He looked at the court, the full assembly, every face, every faction, the galleries and the wall positions, and Lord Aldrich in his front left placement. He let the look move through the room with the deliberate completeness of a king who was making sure. Every person present understood that he was speaking to all of them and not managing a bilateral negotiation. Then he said, "She is right." 3 words, followed by 4 more, "And I was wrong." The hall absorbed this. He said, 3 years ago I sat in this seat, and I allowed a procedure to proceed that I had the authority and the moral responsibility to stop. I did not stop it. I told myself it was a matter of protocol. It was a matter of cowardice, and I have known the difference for 3 years. And I am saying it plainly now in front of this full court, because plain speech in the correct room at the correct cost is the only adequate response to what I failed to do with plain speech 3 years ago in the same room. He looked at Ran. He said, "This woman is not a person of crown interest. She is not an unattributed infrastructure asset. She is not a procedural question awaiting legal review. She is the person who built the roads that are keeping this kingdom alive, and she is the person I failed, and she is the person who walked back into this hall today without my protection or my escort, or any external authority, and said her own name out loud in a room that voted to erase it, and I am asking this court to understand that the room was wrong and I was wrong, and the only correct response to that wrongness is to dismantle it." Lord Aldrich rose. His voice was controlled. It was always controlled. He said, "Your Majesty, the legal record of the household vote stands. Whatever the right has established ceremonially, the procedural record." Caelen said, "The procedural record will be addressed tomorrow, in full, by royal decree. Today I am asking this court not for a procedural response, but for a human one. I am asking every person in this room to look at what is standing in front of them and to understand what it cost her to stand there, and to ask themselves what it should cost us to respond honestly." Lord Aldrich stood for a moment longer. Then he sat down. Not in defeat, not entirely, but in the recognition, the slow, reluctant, genuine recognition, that the room had shifted in a way that procedural preparation could not fully address. Because what had shifted was not a legal position, but something older and more stubborn than law. The room was quiet. In the quiet, someone in the gallery began to stand. Not a lord. A young woman, one of the court's lower administrative staff, someone Rand did not recognize. Someone who had no political stake in the outcome, and no faction to represent, and no sophisticated calculation driving her to her feet. She stood because she had been sitting and listening, and something in her had decided that sitting was no longer the correct physical expression of where she was. Then another person stood. Then 3 more. Rand stood in the center of the great hall and watched the room decide, one person at a time, what kind of room it wanted to be. And she felt the warmth of the foundation beneath the palace floor rise through the soles of her feet with the steady patience of stone that had been waiting a long time for exactly this weight to stand on it. The royal decree took 1 day to write and 4 centuries to become necessary. Caelen worked on it through the night following the great hall session, which was not unusual for him. He had always done his best thinking in the hours when the palace was quiet and the weight of the crown's daily theater had packed itself away until morning. What was unusual was that he was not working alone. Rand sat across the work table from him with the kingdom's legal codex open before her and a cup of tea cooling at her elbow. And they worked the way she had always done her best work, in focused parallel. 2 people in the same room thinking hard about the same problem from their respective angles. The silence between them the productive kind rather than the absent kind. She knew the legal codex better than he did. He had accepted this with approximately 30 seconds of the particular internal recalibration that a king required when confronted with the fact that someone else had mastered his own kingdom's foundational documents more thoroughly than he had. And then he had set the recalibration aside and moved on. Because the work was more important than the accounting of who knew what. And Rand's knowledge of the codex was an asset to the work regardless of what it implied about the previous 4 years of her employment as a household accounts keeper in a noble estate. She found the gift use statute's original context first. She laid it out for him in the precise and economical way she laid out everything. Here is what the statute says. Here is what it was written to address. Here is the gap between those two things and the situation Lord Aldrich attempted to apply it to. Here is the legal argument for why the gap is not bridgeable without a fundamental misreading of the statute's scope. He read it, and he agreed, and he began drafting the relevant section of the decree. And she read his draft and suggested 2 adjustments that made it more precise and less susceptible to the kind of creative reinterpretation that Lord Aldrich's faction had demonstrated it was capable of. He made the adjustments without argument. This was, she noted privately, different from the King Caelen of 4 years ago, who had sat in a high seat and managed situations from a careful distance. That king had been competent and controlled and fundamentally alone in the particular way of people, who had decided that consulting others was a form of vulnerability rather than a form of intelligence. This king was not that king. The change had not happened suddenly. It had happened over 3 years and 3 days in a way station and a valley and a map room. In the accumulated weight of looking honestly at what his competence and control had cost someone who deserved better. She noted it. She did not say it. Some things were more accurately expressed in the present tense of action than in the past tense of acknowledgement. By the time the night had become technical morning, the hour when darkness was still complete but had begun carrying the faint promise of a direction, the decree had its 3 core sections. The first section addressed the gift use statute directly. Ran had found, in the Codex's supplementary record, a secondary statute that predated the gift use statute by 80 years, and that established, in language considerably more absolute than the later document, that a gift-bearer's gift was the irrevocable personal property of the bearer and could not be claimed, taxed, conscripted, or otherwise appropriated by any crown, noble house, or institutional authority without the bearer's explicit consent. The secondary statute had never been formally repealed. It had simply been written around for 400 years by people who found it inconvenient. Caelen's decree reinstated it as operative law, explicitly superseding the gift use statute in all cases involving gift bearers who had not entered into formal consent agreements. She had found this statute in her 2nd year of exile in a village elder's copy of the Codex, on a wet evening in a farmhouse with a leaking roof, and she had copied it into her ledger on the page behind the pressed wildflower. She had been waiting for the right room to put it in. The second section addressed the vote of removal. Caelen had spent the longest time on this section, not because it was legally complex, but because it required him to be specific about his own failure in language that would become permanent public record. And he was working, she understood, to be specific without being performative, to acknowledge without making the acknowledgement about himself rather than about the systemic wrong it was documenting. He showed her 3 drafts. She told him honestly which one was accurate, and which 2 were slightly managing the truth in the direction of palatability. He used the accurate one. The section established a formal review mechanism for any vote of removal from a noble household or court position that had occurred in the previous 100 years without documented cause meeting a newly specified evidentiary standard. It did not overturn the votes automatically. That would have been legally unstable and practically unworkable, but it created a pathway for challenge and redress. And it established that the Crown considered undocumented removal a matter of royal concern rather than private household administration. It named, specifically, the vote that had occurred 3 years ago in Lord Aldrich's Great Hall, and it named the person that vote had been used against. And it stated plainly that the Crown found the vote to have been without adequate cause, and that the record was hereby formally contested by royal decree. She read this section 3 times. She did not cry. She had not expected to, but she held the words for a moment in the interior of herself with the careful attention of someone receiving something that mattered. And she let herself receive it properly rather than immediately moving on to the next item, because some things deserve the full length of their own moment. She said, "This is accurate." He said, "It is the minimum accuracy requires." "I know that." She said, "Yes. But minimum accuracy after 4 years of convenient inaccuracy is worth noting." He looked at her. She looked back, the particular quality of looking that they had developed in the Marin Valley and the palace courtyard, full, direct, neither performing nor managing, simply seeing. He said, "There is a 3rd section." She said, "The builder's record." He said, "Yes." The 3rd section was the one she cared about most, and had thought about the longest. It established that any infrastructure built on crown or noble land and subsequently proven to have been used for public benefit, proven, not merely claimed, carried the legal obligation of attributed record. The builder's name in the public record, not as a courtesy, as a legal requirement, going forward and, with a grace period for documentation, backward through the existing infrastructure the kingdom had benefited from without attribution. Every road Ran had built would carry her name in the kingdom's permanent public record. Not the Omega, not the road woman, not the unattributed origin. Ran of the eastern roads. Ran who walked. Ran, daughter of Sela. Her full name, her mother's name, both of them together, in the record that could not be voted on or suspended or declared procedurally inconvenient. She looked at this section for a long time. She said, "My mother's name." He said, "She should be in the record too." She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, she should." The decree was completed before full dawn. Caelen sent it to the palace's legal office for formal transcription with instructions that it be ready for public reading at the morning session. He leaned back in his chair and looked across the work table at Ran, who was closing the codex with the careful hands of someone returning something borrowed in better condition than they found it. He said, "Lord Aldrich will challenge it." She said, "Yes. He will find the weakest structural point and press it. The gift-use reinstated statute is his best angle. He will argue that the secondary statutes' 80-year precedence over the gift-use statute has been operationally superseded by 400 years of contrary practice." He said, "And." She said, "And he will be technically interesting but ultimately incorrect. Because operational supersession without formal repeal does not constitute legal supersession. And I have 3 village elders and a high priest who will testify to that if the challenge reaches a formal hearing." He looked at her. He said, "You have been preparing this for 2 years." She said, "I have been preparing this since the second time I read the codex in a farmhouse with a leaking roof in my second year of exile. I did not know exactly which room I would need it in, but I knew I would need it." He said, "I believe you would have found this room eventually with or without me." She considered this. She said, "Probably, but it is better with you in it, when you are in it correctly." He held her gaze. She said quietly, "You were in it correctly last night, and this morning." He said nothing, but the quality of his silence was the honest kind, the kind that received rather than deflected, and she let him receive it. The morning session of the court convened at the 7th hour. The decree was read in full by the High Steward. In the formulaic language of official proclamation that gave even the most radical content the surface appearance of procedural normalcy. The court listened. Lord Aldrich's faction exchanged the rapid micro-expressions of a group performing real-time legal assessment. Lord Aldrich rose to speak when the reading concluded. His challenge was precisely what Ran had anticipated, technically careful, procedurally framed, pressing the operational supersession argument on the secondary statute with the precision of a man who had spent the night with his own legal advisors. Ran spoke for 4 minutes in response. She cited the specific codex sections. She cited the legal theory of formal versus operational supersession. She cited 3 historical cases in which operational supersession arguments had failed in the kingdom's own court record. She was concise and exact, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not need to because every word was load-bearing, and the structure they built together held perfectly. Lord Aldrich sat down. Not in defeat. In the recalibrated assessment of a strategic man who recognized that the ground had shifted in a way that required new calculation rather than continued pressure on a position that had been outbuilt. In the gallery, Lady Mira watched Ran speak, and the expression on her face was one that Ran, if she had looked up and seen it, would have recognized, the expression of a woman watching something she had not been taught to expect and was in the process of deciding she wanted to learn from. Ran did not look up. She was already thinking about the next thing. She said to the court, when the legal section had concluded, "There is one more matter. I am requesting the court's formal support for the establishment of an institution. Its name, location, and function I will describe in full at the next session. Its purpose, briefly stated, is this: to ensure that the next Omega born with a foundational gift does not spend 4 years invisible and 3 years in exile before the kingdom benefits from what she carries. The court was quiet. Then, in the gallery, someone began to stand again. The title had no precedent. That was the point. Ran had understood, from the moment she began thinking clearly about what the right's completion meant and what the decree's legal framework had established, that accepting an existing title would mean accepting the existing title's existing limitations. Queen Consort carried specific constraints about political authority that had been built into the role over 300 years of careful noble house negotiation. Royal advisor carried the limitation of advisory status, the opinion without the vote, the council without the binding authority. Every existing title in the kingdom's formal hierarchy had been shaped, over time, by the people who had created it to serve purposes that were not her purposes, and slipping into one of them would have been like walking a road someone else had laid in a direction she had not chosen. She had spent a considerable amount of time in exile thinking about what she would call herself if she ever had the chance to choose. She had known the answer for a long time. She had simply been waiting for the room. When the High Steward asked, at the formal title confirmation ceremony 2 days after the decree's reading, what designation she would hold, she said it without hesitation or performance. In the same level and precise voice she used for all things that were simply true and required no additional scaffolding of emotion to make their truth apparent. Road Sovereign. The High Steward wrote it down. His pen paused once, very briefly. Above the parchment, the pause of a man encountering a word combination that his 40 years of ceremonial record-keeping had not prepared him for. And then he wrote it. Because it had been spoken, and it was the correct word, and his job was to record correct words regardless of whether they had been recorded before. The title was not symbolic. Ran had spent 2 nights writing its charter, working from the legal framework the decree had established and building outward from it with the same methodical intention she brought to road surveys, beginning from what the ground actually was and designing for what it actually needed rather than for what would have been easiest to build. The charter specified 3 distinct areas of authority. The first was infrastructure sovereignty. The road sovereign held the permanent legal right to commission, design, build, and protect infrastructure anywhere within the kingdom's borders, on any land regardless of noble house jurisdiction, without requiring prior authorization from any court, council, or noble house. This right was irrevocable by any mechanism short of the road sovereign's own voluntary surrender, which was protected from coercion by a specific clause that Ran had written with Lord Aldrich's faction specifically in mind, establishing that any attempt to compel surrender of the sovereign's rights through procedural pressure, social isolation, vote, or threat constituted a violation of the Charter's foundational protections. She had written this clause with the particular satisfaction of someone sealing a specific gap that had cost them 4 years. The second area of authority was mobility. The road sovereign held the right to move freely across all crown and noble land, to speak in any court of the kingdom regardless of the court's formal rank hierarchy, and to access any public record bearing on infrastructure, trade, or the welfare of the kingdom's borderland regions. This authority had the practical effect of making Ran, in perpetuity, impossible to restrict to a room or a household or a position from which she could be voted out. The third area of authority was the one she had thought about most carefully and had taken the most time to draft, because it was the one with the longest reach. The road sovereign held the standing to establish and govern institutions of learning and sanctuary for gift-bearers of any rank, including and specifically Omegas and other low-ranked individuals whose gifts had been historically suppressed, undocumented, or claimed by noble houses without the bearer's consent. This was the authority that would build the academy. She presented the charter at the morning session. Caelen had read it the previous evening and had made no changes and had said, when he finished reading it and looked up at her across the work table where the decree had been written, simply, "This is right." She had said, "I know." He had said, "I mean that in the technical legal sense as well as the other sense." She had said, "I know that too." The court ratified the charter with a majority sufficient to establish it as permanent law. Lord Aldrich's faction voted against it in a block, which she had expected and had designed the majority threshold to accommodate. 3 members of Lord Aldrich's faction voted for it, which she had not entirely expected, and which told her something useful about the internal fracture lines within that faction that she filed for future reference. The formal investiture took place in the temple courtyard, because it was Ran who chose the location, and Ran was not inclined to be invested in a great hall that had been designed. In its architecture and its seating arrangements and its procedural traditions. To express a hierarchy, she was in the business of revising. The temple courtyard was open sky and old stone, and the particular quality of morning light that made everything it touched look as though it had always been there and always would be. High Priest Edrin performed the investiture with the gravity of a man who understood that he was participating in something that would be in the historical record for a very long time, and was conducting himself accordingly. He placed the Road Sovereign's mark, not a crown, not a chain of office, but a small permanent mark on the back of her right hand, pressed there by the ceremonial stone of the kingdom's oldest road, the same stone she had walked in the right, and said the words of formal establishment in the oldest ceremonial language of the kingdom. She felt the mark settle into her skin with the same quality as the gift settling into stone, permanently, without drama, simply becoming part of what she was. Caelen stood to her left. He had asked privately the previous evening what his role was in the investiture, and she had said, "You stand beside me, not in front of me, and not behind me." He had said, "Yes." And he had stood exactly there, in exactly that position, with the stillness of a man who had learned the difference between presence and override. After the ceremony, in the quieter part of the morning when the formal proceedings had concluded and the court had dispersed into the various adjustments that followed any seismic institutional change, Ran walked to the way station road she had laid in the first weeks of exile. The section near the palace's eastern gate, the first road she had built with full intention, the oldest of the 23. She crouched at its beginning, and she pressed her fingers to the first stone. Warm still. 3 years of warmth, held without diminishment. She thought about the Waywalker Academy. She had the location already chosen, a crossroads site in the borderland region, equidistant from 4 of her major road junctions. On land she had identified in her second year of exile as having the particular quality of ground that her gift recognized as foundationally exceptional. The kind of ground that resonated. The kind of ground that knew. She had sketched the Academy's first buildings in the margins of her survey notes, a central learning hall, dormitories designed with the practical knowledge of someone who had spent 3 years sleeping in way station cottages and had strong opinions about what adequate shelter actually required, workrooms for gift development and study, a road that circled the entire campus so that every student arriving at the Academy walked, from their very first step on the grounds, on a surface that held and answered and remembered. The first enrollment would be open to any gift-bearer below the rank of minor noble. This was the starting point. It was not the ending point. She was thinking in terms of generations. The way roads were built, for the weight of traffic not yet born, for the needs of people who would walk them long after the builder's hand had moved on. She stood up from the road. Caelen was there, having followed her from the ceremony with the quiet attentiveness that had become his characteristic mode in her company. Present without press, close without override. He did not ask what she was thinking. He had learned, in the weeks since the Marin Valley, that she thought out loud when she was ready to and not before. And that patience was the correct response to the thinking before the speaking, rather than the restless conversational filling of silence that less secure people defaulted to. She said, "I am going to build one more road. Before the Academy. Before anything else." He said, "Where to?" She looked north. The northern border was the kingdom's last isolated region, a high, difficult terrain of steep ridges and narrow valleys that had resisted every previous infrastructure attempt, that the engineers had consistently declared impractical, that the borderland governors had long since stopped filing petitions about because the petitions never resulted in anything. A region of people who had been functionally outside the kingdom for 3 generations while technically inside it. She said, "North. The high ridges. The people who have been waiting the longest." He said, "The engineers have said for 40 years that the northern terrain is impassable for road construction." She said, "The engineers were not walking it themselves." He looked at her. She looked at the north. She said, "I will go in the spring, when the ground is ready." He said, "I will ride with you." She looked at him. The particular quality of looking that had developed between them, full, honest, seeing clearly rather than managing carefully. She said, "Stay on the road's edge." He said, with the steadiness of a man saying something he intended to keep, always. That evening they walked together on the oldest road near the palace's eastern gate, the first road she had laid, the warmest of them all, the one that knew her longest. The city's evening sounds moved around them, and the road's warmth rose through their feet, and the bond between them was the easy and honest kind. The kind that did not need managing because it had been earned properly and built on ground that had been surveyed with care. He reached for her hand. She took it. They walked east in the last of the light, on a road she had built before she knew what she was building toward. And the stone beneath them held with the permanent and unconditional patience of something that had always known this weight was coming and had been making itself ready. Time moved differently on roads. Ran had known this since her first deliberate step on the king's highway 3 years into what had then been called her exile, and what she had come to think of, in the years since, simply as the first chapter of her actual life, the chapter in which she had stopped waiting for the world to see her, and had started making the world hold her instead. Time on roads had a quality that time in halls and courts and procedurally managed sessions did not. It was forward-moving by nature. It did not double back. It did not suspend itself pending review. It went where it went, and it took you with it if you kept walking. She was still walking. The Waywalker Academy had been open for 2 years now. It stood at the crossroads she had chosen, equidistant from 4 of the great eastern roads. Its buildings exactly as she had sketched them in the margins of her survey notes in an exile that felt, from this side of it, like something that had happened to a woman she understood completely and had never quite been. The central learning hall was built from the same stone as the roads, with the same quality of permanence. She had walked its foundation herself before the first wall went up, and every student who crossed its threshold crossed it on a surface that held and answered and knew. The dormitories had adequate roof pitch and no steps higher than standard rise because she had designed them herself, and she had strong opinions. The workrooms were full most mornings of people learning to understand the specific language of their gifts. Gifts that had been carried in silence for years, and that were now being given the extraordinary luxury of being named and studied and developed in a room designed for exactly that purpose. The enrollment had outgrown its first intake within 8 months. She had not been surprised. She had designed the expansion provisions into the original charter. The road that circled the campus was the warmest road she had ever built. She had not intended it to be warmer than the others. She had walked it with the same deliberate intention she walked everything, but there was something about the ground at that crossroads, the foundational quality she had identified in her second year of exile, that responded to the gift with a depth she had not encountered in any other site. Students who walked the campus road in the early morning, before the day's learning began, consistently reported that it helped them think. That the warmth in the stone had a quality they could not articulate precisely, but that functioned like confirmation, like the ground saying yes. You are here, you are real, your gift is real, keep walking. She thought her mother would have had something to say about this. She thought about Caelen often, not with the sharp grief of the first years or the managed ache of the exile years, but with the softer, more complicated feeling of someone who had spent a long time understanding a person after losing them, understanding what Caelen had known, and what she had feared, and what she had carried, and what she had given her daughter in the form of a lesson that Ran had broken, and in the form of a deeper inheritance that she had not. Cielen's name was in the public record now, in the attribution section of every road Ran had built, which the kingdom's official cartographic registry now maintained in the same detail, and with the same permanence as any other public infrastructure record. The builder's name was listed in full, Ran, daughter of Caelen, road sovereign of the kingdom. Her mother's name in the record of every road. In the record that could not be voted on or suspended or declared procedurally inconvenient. She had stood in the registry office the first time she saw it printed in the official form, and she had been quiet for a long time, and the registry clerk, a young woman who had been at the academy in its first intake and had subsequently applied for the registry position because she wanted to work in a room where names were accurately kept, had not interrupted the quiet. She had understood what it was. The Equal Council had been sitting for 18 months. It was the 4th formal reform that had followed the road sovereign's establishment, the one that had taken the longest to negotiate because it required the largest structural change to the court's existing power distribution. The council seated 16 members, 2 from each of the kingdom's 8 major regions, elected by those regions' populations rather than appointed by noble houses. One seat was permanently designated for the Road Sovereign, or the Road Sovereign's formal representative. The noble houses retained their court standing, but their control of the governing council had been restructured from absolute majority to a proportional share that required coalition building with the regional seats rather than overriding them. Lord Aldrich had not sat in that council. He had retired from public positions 6 months after the Road Sovereign's charter was ratified, citing personal reasons in language sufficiently opaque to cover a full range of actual reasons. Wren did not know which of the actual reasons had tipped the balance, and she had not expended effort finding out. She wished him a quiet retirement and meant it, not because she had forgiven him the way a person forgave a friend for a small wrong, but because she had arrived at the particular equanimity that came from having built something large enough and permanent enough that the person who had tried to erase you could no longer determine the scale of your concern. She was thinking about all of this, not in the ruminative way of someone looking backward, but in the particular forward-leaning way of someone assessing where they had been in order to understand clearly where they were going. On a morning in early spring when the northern road had finally reached its planned beginning point. The north. She stood at the road's starting marker, which she had placed herself the previous autumn. A flat stone pressed into the earth at the base of the first ridge, smooth and warm, with a small impression in its surface that was the shape of a 5-petaled wildflower. Behind her, the kingdom's road network spread south and east and west in 23 great lines and 14 newer ones built in the years since the rite, the whole of it glowing faintly in the morning's new light in the way that only she could see it, the gift's view of its own work. The warmth map of a kingdom made more itself by being connected to itself. Ahead of her, the northern ridges. The high, difficult, engineer-declared impassable terrain of steep valley and narrow gorge that had kept the North's people 3 generations outside the kingdom while technically inside it. The people who had been waiting longest. The ground she had come to walk. The spring air was cold here. The kind of cold that was not hostile but honest. The cold of a place that had been left alone long enough to forget it was waiting for anything. That would need to be approached with the same patience she brought to every piece of ground that had a history of being overlooked. She knew this kind of ground. She had a specific relationship with this kind of ground. It had always, in her experience, responded well. She became aware of Caelen beside her before he spoke. The way she had become aware of him in the Marin Valley on the day he came down the hillside, his presence registering in the bond before it registered in any of the physical senses. He was wearing his riding clothes and his practical boots, and he had, as he had done every time she took a new road north or east or into difficult terrain in the years since the Marin Valley, come without his formal escort. Just himself, a man beside his person on a road. She felt him look at her profile. She felt, with the particular quality of attention she had developed for the specific texture of his attention, it was distinct. The way all the things that belonged to you were distinct from things that merely resembled them, that he was not looking at the northern ridges or the spring sky or the starting marker. He was looking at her. She did not turn to look back at him yet. She was looking at the road ahead. She was aware of the weight she carried, distributed in the specific configuration of this particular morning, the ledger at her hip, the survey notes in her coat's inner pocket, the pressed wildflower on the oldest page. The warmth in her feet that was the gift in its fully realized state, patient and ready and deeply itself. And something else, something that was neither the gift nor the ledger nor the survey. Something that had been making itself known for 2 months in the particular quiet way of things that were true before they were spoken. She placed her hand flat against the front of her coat. A warmth there that was not the gift. Smaller. Newer. The first warmth of something that was not yet a person, but was going to be. The first presence of a life that had not yet begun its walking, but was already on the way. She had known for 6 weeks. She had told Caelen 3 weeks ago. At the end of an ordinary evening on the oldest road near the palace's eastern gate. In the quiet between streetlight and starlight, in the warm stone dark. He had been very still for a long moment, the deep listening stillness. Not the absent kind, and then he had said, simply a road builder. And she had said, or something else entirely. And he had said, or something else entirely, with all the warmth in the world in it. She turned and looked at him now. He was watching her face with the expression she had learned over years and valleys and difficult terrain and 3 laws and 14 new roads, and 1 right and 1 title and 1 equal counsel. The expression of a man who had learned, at significant personal cost, the difference between looking through someone and seeing them, and who had chosen seeing and never once looked away from the choice. She said, "Stay on the road's edge." He moved to the road's edge. She turned back to the north. She thought, "My child will walk this. Their feet will know this stone, and it will hold them." She took the first step. The ground answered her. The stone formed beneath her heel, warm, permanent. The beginning of a road that would take months and difficult terrain and all the patience the north had earned by waiting. And she kept walking, and Caelen walked beside her at the road's edge. And behind them the road extended itself in the early spring light, stone by stone, step by step. The way all things worth building extended themselves, one choice at a time, in the right direction, held by the earth that had always known she was coming. The northern ridges rose before her. She walked toward them. The road followed. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.